king's grandson. They will tell them that you killed a prisoner, the uncle of the king, who had surrendered, and that shall be that. He won't tell them what Kevan Lannister did," he muttered, unable to stop the scorn seeping into his voice. "Of course not," Robb agreed. "But it does not matter. The truth will come out, and when it does you can stand tall. You did as you should have done. Father will come around." He shifted slightly, leaning more heavily on one side, the side that was closest to Robb, until they were nearly touching, and heaved out a deep breath. The warmth he could feel from his brother was more reassuring than any words could be. "I know I could not have let him live after what he did. I would have lost the Karstarks and the Mormonts if I had, and I cannot lose the Lords of the North. What use is a king who cannot even keep the faith of his most loyal allies and avid supporters?" "Not much," Robb replied wryly. "Try not to dwell on it. Skulking around in the hole and lurking in the dungeons brooding is the behavior of Jon Snow the bastard, not Jon Snow the king." He snorted. "I shall be both. The bastard king. Sounds like a name we should have given Joffrey," he muttered darkly. Robb barked out a laugh and slapped him on the back, sending him staggering forwards a few steps. Robb then clapped him on the back again once Jon had regained his equilibrium. There was a noise behind them that made them both turn to watch as Lord Root trotted past, a group of servants following him. Robb quirked an eyebrow at Jon, and he nodded, then watched as his brother headed off in the direction Lord Root had gone. He liked Richard Root. He was a good man, level-headed and smart with a broad smile. Great Jon Umber appeared to have taken to the man as well, which only served to cement Jon's acceptance of Lord Root given how hard it was to earn the praise and loyalty of a man like Great Jon Umber. He turned his attention back to the direwolves and Winter and watched as Grey Wind's ears pricked up, and then as the direwolf rose to his feet and trotted leisurely past the burning pyres, past Jon and in the direction Robb had gone. He sighed. Robb was right, of course. But it still weighed heavily on him. Taking the life of Kevan Lannister had not been something he had done lightly. House Karstark and House Mormont may have kept fighting by his side in the wars to come, but they would have resented him, and he would have known it. His eyes flicked over Winter as she lifted her head and then dropped it again. He could not help but think that, finally, her excessive growth was beginning to slow, and although he knew he should wish for her to be larger and stronger, there was a part of him that was glad. She reminded him of one of the hound puppies they had once had at Winterfell. It had grown so much bigger than its litter mates until, eventually, it was nearly twice their size. But with that there had been complications, it could not run as far, and its joints were weak. He did not wish that fate on Winter. Riders approach. Someone called from on the battlements above, jerking him out of his thoughts. He glanced up toward the voice, meeting the eyes of a soldier who gestured towards the north, and then back towards the fields outside Harrenhal. He squinted slightly, unable to see anything through the smog. Eventually, when he realized that he would be unable to see anything for a few moments, he turned to one of the soldiers nearby. "Shall we lower the gate, Your Grace?" Lord Root asked, appearing next to him before Jon could speak. "No. They will have seen the smoke of the pyres and heard what happened by now. Word spreads. If they ride for us, they are either allies or Lannister soldiers with terms." Lord Root nodded. "Your father was with Lady Whent. I shall go and find him for you." "Thank you, my lord," he murmured, turning back to look at Winter. He tugged carefully on the bond with Winter and tried to send her warning about the new arrivals. In the distance, he saw her lift her great head and peer in the direction the riders were approaching from. Then she rose to her feet, jostling Ghost, who scampered up and gazed in the same direction as though understanding what was happening. Ghost let out a loud howl and began to run in the direction of the keep. Once he was safely halfway across the distance between where he had been laying and Harrenhal, Winter launched herself into the air with a loud roar. He tilted his head up to watch as she circled widely around the castle. She didn't roar again and instead seemed to be unconcerned. Her wings beat steadily, and he could feel her contentment reaching through their bond. There was something else as well, but he could not place it. "Brother." "She is not concerned," he replied, turning his gaze away from Winter and toward Robb, who had reappeared. "Either she believes they mean us no harm, or she recognizes a scent, somehow." Robb didn't answer, instead his eyes were fixed to the north where four figures had just emerged from the smoke. Jon watched them too. The four rode two abreast, close together and with no weapons drawn. Can you make out who it is? He called up to the soldiers. No, your grace, one called back. He nodded and glanced at Ghost, who seemed unperturbed. They do not seem worried, Rob remarked. He nodded again, feeling an uncomfortable weight settle in his gut, and looked at his brother. They must recognize the scent of whoever it is. Rob tensed and his eyes moved past John back to the lands beyond Harrenhal. Surely not. He half shrugged his shoulders. Lord Root said your grandfather was sick. Mayhaps she wishes to pay her respects. With the war as it is, she is safer traveling with us than she would be alone. Rob hissed quietly but straightened until he was standing at his full height and threw his shoulders back. She would have been safer leaving the Eyrie and heading north, to White Harbor. Bran and Rickon need their mother. Together, they watched as the figures drew closer. Within moments he was able to recognize the hair of one of the riders. He shifted slightly, unable to help himself. He couldn't pull his eyes away as they drew closer, even when he heard father arrive next to him and let out a surprised noise when he too recognized his wife. Above their heads, Winter let out a roar as the riders passed under the main gate, as though to warn them what awaited them should they prove to not be friendly. The horse Lady Stark was on balked slightly, but she managed to calm it. On her other side, a grim-looking man with grey hair but the same bright blue tully eyes, glanced up at Winter with a scowl. Behind them, the other two men did not so much as blink. There was a long pause whilst those gathered in the courtyard and those on horseback gazed at each other. He tried to avert his eyes. Lady Stark, he said. He cleared his throat in embarrassment and to try and dislodge the lump that was building up in it. We had not thought to see you here, but you are most welcome. He paused and glanced towards the man who could only be the Blackfish and said, and you as well, Lord Brynden. Come, partake of bread and salt. His eyes returned to Lady Stark, who was looking at him with a peculiar expression on her face. Eventually, she nodded at him, slid off her horse and immediately dropped into a curtsy. Bread and salt would be most welcome, your grace. Asterisk asterisk. Lady Shella is my aunt, she was my mother's eldest sister. He glanced toward Lady Stark and raised an eyebrow, unable to help himself. They were sequestered in the room he had claimed as his solar. Rob and father had taken Brynden and the two other men, Lord Yohn Royce and Lord Gunthor Grafton, to find food and for a bath. He had suggested that Lady Stark go with them, but she had refused and instead asked to speak with him privately. They had been in his solar at least an hour now, judging by the movement of the sun in the sky, and the words she had just said were the first she had spoken in all that time. Instead, she had been inspecting him carefully with an expression on her face that he had been unable to place. For his part, he had nothing to say to her, he had come to terms with everything a long time ago. But if she wished to talk to him, he would hear her out. She is recovering well, he finally said, when it became clear Lady Stark would not speak again. She nodded but did not speak. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and she kept her gaze on his face, despite the fact she was clearly not happy and was uncomfortable looking at him too long. It was strange, he thought, how their positions had changed. The last time they had been in the same room she had screamed at him and wished him gone, and now, here she was, unable to tear her eyes away from him. Her face was rigid and tense, as though she equally could not bring herself to look at him but could not look away. He watched her carefully as her eyes tightened slightly before the tension eased around her mouth. I wish to apologize, Lady Stark said carefully. Her gaze flicked from his face to the window and then back again. For my actions in the Eyrie and at the Crossroads Inn. The Crossroads Inn. She nodded once. I acted rashly and impulsively. She paused and licked her lips. Family, duty, honor. I have failed those words every day for 6 and 10 years. But I failed those words most when I took Tyrion Lannister hostage. I thought I was doing the right thing, getting justice for my son after what they did, and I had reason to believe, and still do, that he had owned the knife that the Catspaw used. Yet I have brought disgrace on House Stark and House Tully and started a war. The Riverlands and the North will pay the price for it. I should have expected everything that has happened since. I should have considered what would have happened if he had asked for trial by combat and won. He did not speak for a moment and instead considered her carefully. After living with her for most of his life, he knew that the words she had just said were the closest to an apology that he was going to get. Lady Stark was no weak maiden to throw herself in front of him and apologize for her treatment of him, particularly when she would still feel that way if the manner of his birth was now not abundantly clear. Nonetheless, she had apologized for treating him as she had done given his birth. He shifted slightly, keeping his eyes on hers. He wished to be angry at her, to say that he had been a child and that he had not deserved her treatment, yet his mind kept flicking back to what Eamon would say. What he would think about her words, what he would think about all that had happened and what he would be thinking about the future. "Are you apologizing because you think it is what I wish to hear?" he asked eventually. When her eyes flicked away from his face, he sighed. "Lady Stark, you did not make a mistake. Based off the information you had and what you thought, you did precisely what nearly every other person would have done." Her eyes widened and she opened her mouth but seemed unable to speak and so closed it again. He watched as she heaved out a deep breath and her fingers that had been clasped in her lap untightened slightly and went slack. "For all our differences, Lady Stark, we are united on one thing. We love House Stark. We love Bran," he continued. "Had I been there with you and thought what you thought, that Tyrion was responsible, then I likely would have done the same. The Tyrion Lannister you thought capable of hurting Bran, the one you saw at the Crossroads Inn, would have told his siblings that he had seen you there, and it would have had repercussions. Your trip to King's Landing was meant to be a secret and you did not have the information that we have since gleaned. We shall talk more on it later, once you are rested, if you wish. But, as I said, you did precisely what nearly every other person would have done, you protected your family in the way you thought best. You are not the Jon Snow that left for the wall," she said quietly. "You are changed." "I had no choice," he replied. She looked at him, another strange expression on her face. "You do not resent me, for what I did? If you did, we would not be speaking like this." Her voice was different when she spoke that time, less deferential, more observing and yet thoughtful. She was talking about his childhood now. About the past. "I did, once," he said finally, unable to stop the bitterness creeping into his voice. "I would have done anything, when I was a child, to secure your affection, and if I could not get that, then at least your tolerance. I would never have tried to usurp Robb. I would never have hurt Bran or Rickon nor Arya or Sansa. I love them. They are my brothers and sisters. And now. Did you know there is a Targaryen Maester at the wall?" "I did not." "Aemon Targaryen, he was the brother of Aegon V," he replied. "He is 100 name days. He grew up in King's Landing and spent years serving his brother on Dragonstone. He knows the South." Lady Stark glanced down at her hands in her lap. "You could have sent me away. You could have had me killed. Many others would have," he continued. "I am sure that Lady Margaery Tyrell's grandmother, Lady Olenna, would have had me meet an unfortunate end the day she met me. You could have forced father to make me leave, I am sure of that. Yet, for all your scorn, you let me stay. You gave me shelter and food. You did not treat me well, but you could have treated me far worse than you did. I thought for the longest time that you hated me, but I do not think you did. I think you hated what I represented. What you thought my father had done. Living proof that Ned Stark was not a man of his word. Proof you had to see with your own eyes every day for 5 and 10 years. She sucked in a breath and, finally, broke eye contact. Her eyes were on her hands again, her fingers tied together as though she was stopping herself from doing something that was not ladylike. When she next spoke, "I was cruel. I told you I wished it was you instead who lay on that bed. You were," he agreed. "You were also a mother grieving for a son she thought might never wake up." He sighed. "I feared you for years. I was scared that one day you would throw me out. That day when I came to see Bran, I was almost too scared to step into the room. But you did." "I did. And I told you I wished it had been you," she said. "You did," he agreed, speaking for both what she had said and the fact she had meant it. "I cannot say sorry," she whispered. "I felt what I felt that day." He nodded. "But I will say that I am sorry for saying it," she said. "It was cruel. Needlessly cruel. I could claim it was my grief in thinking that I would lose Bran. But it was not. It was cruel for cruelty's sake, and I am sorry for it." He nodded again. "I cannot say that I forgive you. But I do understand. It does not make it easier to accept, but I understand. It was her turn to nod this time, her eyes flicked up to meet his. Her mouth opened and then she closed it again. You can speak freely, he said cautiously. You have never been afraid to hide your thoughts from me before, Lady Stark. Please do not start now. I had thought to return to White Harbor, but rumors of the Northern armies marching reached us, she said quietly. Now I see that they are true. I wish to ask a favor. Of course. I would like to accompany the army as it moves to Riverrun. I have heard reports that my father is ill. He will likely not see the year out. I would not seek to keep you from him. Her eyes widened in surprise and then she inclined her head. Thank you, Your Grace. He smiled at her, knowing that the smile was likely brittle but wanting to try and make the situation less uncomfortable. She smiled back in a similar fashion and then glanced away. We will never hold affection for each other, Lady Stark, he said quietly. But you are the mother of my brothers and sisters, and you are my father's wife. When it is just us or family, you may call me John, if you wish, as father and Rob do. It was a peace offering and, given the way her face suddenly softened and then flushed, she knew it. The only time she had called him John, she had then told him seconds later than she wished he had fallen from the tower instead of Bran. She heaved out a deep sigh and her fingers locked together again in her lap. They sat in silence for a few moments before she said quietly, You are a good man, Your Grace. Despite all that I have done, you still offer me the same respect and place that you offer Ned and Rob. She glanced down at her lap, and he watched as her shoulders tightened slightly. I would ask that you call me Caitlin, in private, or Lady Caitlin in public. As you say, we will never hold affection for each other, and I have done much harm to you, but we are family. ****. He left Lady Stark in his solar, sending a guard to find his father less than an hour later. They had not spoken much more. Lady Caitlin had confirmed that the Knights of the Vale had not mustered yet and her sister was showing no inclination to support any of the contenders for the throne, but that Yohn Royce and Lord Grafton's wished to speak to him. It was not lost on him that House Grafton ruled over Gulstown, and so the chances that they already knew of his words with Sir Davos were high, and Yohn Royce had an unwed daughter of a similar age to himself. Nonetheless, it gave him hope that, perhaps, he would secure more support in the next few days. It was still not enough, and his forces were still outnumbered, but it made him feel less apprehensive than he had done before. After that, he had updated Lady Caitlin on Bran and the rest of his siblings, carefully not mentioning the betrothal between Sansa and Gendry, and they had lapsed into silence. Eventually, he had offered to find his father so that he and Lady Caitlin might talk. She had not argued but had instead appeared more tired and frail than she had since she had arrived at Harrenhal. He sighed as he walked down the corridor. He was tired as well. But he could not rest, not yet. He turned left and headed towards the chambers that belonged to Lady Went. The guards outside bowed as he approached. I wish to speak to Lady Went, he said once he was close enough for them to hear him. Please ask her whether she can receive me. One of the guards bowed again and knocked on the door before he disappeared inside. He waited patiently, his mind turning back to Lady Caitlin and wondering, perhaps slightly unfairly, how poorly her conversation with father was going. Lady Went will receive you, Your Grace, the guard said, reappearing suddenly. He nodded and walked past toward the open door. He entered quickly, basking in the heat from the roaring fires inside, and shut the door just as quickly to keep the heat inside. It took him a few moments to find Lady Went in the dark room, but, eventually, he saw her huddled in a big chair by the largest of the three fireplaces. She was wrapped in thick blankets and had a mug clutched between her spindly hands. Lady Went, he said, standing by the door and not moving closer. Thank you for receiving me. Your Grace, Lady Went replied. Please, join me by the warmth. He crossed over to her, not taking offense that she had not risen to greet him. He settled carefully in the chair opposite her that she had gestured to and met her gaze. She was much younger than Aemon, he realized quickly. But the years had not been kind to her in the way they had been to his uncle. She looked haggard and tired, as though she had seen and suffered too much and wished for the end, which she likely did given she had outlived her children, none of whom had children of their own, and her husband. The last went. He could not help but thank the gods that he was not alone, that he had the Starks and Daenerys and Viserys and Aemon. Yet, still, he empathized with what he saw on her face. She was alone. His eyes traced her features quickly. She had probably been beautiful in her youth, she had the same sharp cheekbones that both Lady Stark and Sansa had, and her hair, although nearly all white, bore the signs of having been a vibrant red in her youth. As with Lady Stark and Sansa, her eyes were a bright blue, although they sat more deeply in her head and were far sadder than either Lady Stark's or his sister's. "Do I look like her?" she asked, jerking him out of her perusal. She must have seen confusion in his face, for she clarified, not unkindly, "My niece. Lady Catelyn Stark." "Yes," he replied. "And my sister, Sansa." She nodded, turning her gaze back to the fire. "The guards speak highly of you." He didn't speak but instead watched her carefully. She seemed to be aging before his eyes, as though she was running out of strength. Eventually she sighed and turned back to look to him. "What do you wish from me, your grace?" "Nothing, Lady Whent. I simply wished to see how you were and to discuss what you wish to do when my forces move on." "They shan't try and take Harrenhal again," she replied, her eyes still on the flames. "They will remember what you did here." "You mean Kevan Lannister," he muttered. Then, suddenly feeling defensive, he said, "I had no choice." "I know," she agreed, turning back to look at him. "The guards talk, I heard of what happened. You were left with no choice. But equally the Lannisters shall not try and take this castle again, not now they know of your dragon. So, you will stay?" She nodded. "Why did you come to Harrenhal, your grace?" "I owe House Whent a debt." "You speak of my cousin, Sir Oswell?" "I do." She did not speak for a while, but instead stared at him with sad eyes and a soft smile on her face. "You don't look like Rhaegar," she said eventually, her voice croaky and low-pitched. "But you look like your grandmother, R'hllor. You have her eyes." "My uncle, Aemon, said they are the same eyes that his brother had," he replied. "You knew my grandmother?" She nodded slowly. "We were friends in our youth. No one has spoken to me of her." Lady Whent took a long sip from the mug in her hands, and then her tongue darted out to lick her lips as though savoring the taste of whatever the contents of the mug had been. "The men said you rode on your dragon to burn the gates, but that you dismounted and fought alongside your troops to take back Harrenhal from the Lannisters." "I did." She regarded him carefully for a moment before she nodded again. "Oswell would be proud." "You knew him well?" She shook her head. "I was nearly 20 years his senior, but Walter was fond of his younger brother, and in his youth we saw Oswell often." She sighed and coughed quietly into a handkerchief. "I am weary now, but come back in the morn, bring the morning meal with you, and I shall tell you of R'hllor and of Oswell." 299 AC, Davos Seaworth. Montford Valerian was different from the other lords that Davos had met. He was the blood of old Valyria, and he had not forgotten all his house had done over the centuries of Targaryen rule. House Valerian had provided multiple brides for House Targaryen, including Valina Valerian, the mother of Aegon the Conqueror. They were the oldest and the closest of House Targaryen's allies. It had taken Lord Stannis years to truly earn the, slightly grudging, respect of Montford. Yet Davos knew that Montford had never truly been loyal to Stannis in the manner a bannerman should be. He was not disloyal, he answered summons when they were received, and he provided ships when asked, but there was always a quiet dissatisfaction around the man. It should not have surprised him, therefore, when Montford Valerian arrived at Dragonstone and listened carefully to the address that Stannis gave his mustered bannerman with a small smile on his face. What did surprise him, however, was when Stannis asked to speak to the Lord of the Tides with just Davos and Cresson present. He had half frozen in surprise before he nodded. That had been several minutes before. Now the four of them were sequestered in the chamber of the painted table. He shifted slightly, unable to stop the feeling of apprehension that was beginning to slither through him. Across the table, Montford Valerian was inspecting the table carefully, his eyes moved over the pieces of the board and his lips quirked up slightly. At the head of the table, Stannis was gazing at his bannerman, his brows furrowed in thought. By Davos' side, Cresson breathed loudly and coughed slightly, turning away from Davos as he did so. Eventually, Montford Valerian turned away from the table and looked at Davos. "You met this Jon Snow?" He inclined his head, his eyes flicking from the man opposite him to Stannis and then back again. "I did." "What was he like?" Honest, he replied. Young. The dragon. Big enough to be ridden with ease. If you had to compare it to the skulls in the Red Keep. I do not know their names. Montfort Valerian hummed thoughtfully, his eyes flitting between Stannis and Davos carefully. Can you describe the size of its head relative to any of the skulls you remember? You need not name them, only their position. He glanced at Stannis and saw the man incline his head slightly. Once he had that confirmation, he threw back to the skulls in the cellars of the Red Keep. His mind moved from the largest, the one he knew could only belong to Balerion, to the smallest, the last dragon, before he finally came to a decision about which one he thought it bore the most resemblance to. Eighth from the smallest, he said. Between that and the ninth. You are sure? He paused for half a moment, surprised at how sharply the other man had spoken, before he said, yes. Syrinx, the man said, turning away from Davos to look at Stannis. The ninth dragon from the smallest was Syrinx. The eighth? Stannis asked, his voice tight. Which was the eighth? Vermux. Ah. Syrinx was well over 30 years old, Montfort Valerian said carefully. Vermux only 5 and 10 when he died. But both lived in the dragon pit for much of their lives. Say what you mean, Stannis said, his voice sharp. A dragon that size cannot be young, Montfort Valerian continued, his voice giving no emotion away but instead surprising in its neutrality. Even if it has lived as wild, it cannot be less than 5 and 10 years of age. Confinement to the dragon pit stunted many of the dragons before the dance, but even before then, they did not grow fast. You think Rhaegar hatched a dragon? Aerys could not have, else we would have known, Montfort Valerian said quietly. This is why you wished to speak, Lord Stannis. You wished for my knowledge on the dragons. An uncomfortable, heavy silence settled over the room as they all weighed the words that the Lord of the Tides had spoken. He could not help but flinch at the thought of the Mad King with a dragon, least of all one the size of Jon Snow's. Then his mind turned to the last words that the man had said, and he glanced toward Stannis, who looked, suddenly, like he had aged 20 years in a minute. How did the dragon react to you? He glanced away from Stannis, who was grinding his teeth, likely at the continued prodding from Montfort Valerian, who seemed unwaveringly persistent to find more information out about the dragon, toward the other man. Next to him, Cresson huffed out a sigh. As one would expect. The man raised an eyebrow, then sighed. Did it show any sign of aggression? Did the boy have to control it at all with words or a whip? He shook his head. She roared once when she flew over the harbor and once after. I saw no whip. Why? He flushed, remembering what he had said. I said Rhaenys Targaryen was downed by scorpions by the Dornish. I said that the king's dragon was not invincible. The other man hummed thoughtfully and then nodded. You mean to stick by this allegiance? His eyes swept across the room to settle on Stannis. A dragon that ages easily injured or killed. It will have crossed your mind, Lord Stannis, even before I divulged what I have done, that the dragon is likely young enough that its scales could be penetrated. It could be done. I am sure. A man who cannot be trusted to keep his word has no honor. Montfort Valerian inclined his head. And a man without honor has nothing. My ships are ready to depart when you are, my lord. Leave us. Once the door had snapped shut behind the Lord of Driftmark, Davos exchanged a long look with Cresson. Together they turned to look at Stannis, who was staring at the table, grinding his teeth and his brows creased as though deep in thought. He was looking for something, Cresson said, when it became clear that Stannis would not speak. He wished to be sure that I would not turn on House Targaryen, Stannis muttered. His loyalty has always been to House Targaryen. And you wished to speak to him to see if he knew of the dragon before today? Yes. He would not be so brazen to seek confirmation that you would not betray your agreement with the boy. He was looking for something, Cresson said. As it was, he appeared exactly as you said, loyal to House Targaryen. But he is no fool. He will have known how he looked. Yet he did it anyway. As Davos watched, Stannis and Cresson seemed to have an entire conversation in silence. He watched as Cresson's hands fluttered slightly against the table and Stannis ground his teeth together. Several minutes passed like that, with small eye movements and gestures before Cresson sighed and Stannis jerked his head in a sharp nod. My lord? He asked, feeling as though he may have missed something important. Cresson believes that Lord Montfort was aware of the boy's existence before now but not the dragon's. I do, Cresson said levelly, his voice unwavering in its certainty. But surely if we believe he knew before now, he has placed himself at risk by giving himself away. Not anymore, Stannis muttered. I cannot hang Lord Montfort for a traitor when I cannot prove it. And now we support the same king. I cannot imagine the son of Ned Stark would support the death of a man for keeping a secret from his Lord Paramount. Why did he do it then? If Montfort Valerian has known since the boy was born, he will have kept the secret for the same reason that Ned Stark did, to protect the boy from Robert, Cresson said quietly. Surely the king would not have killed a babe in arms simply because of who his father was? He asked, turning to look at Stannis. The boy was an innocent child. Stannis' mouth set in a grim line, and he put his hands heavily on the table and leaned forward. I cannot say for sure what Robert would have done. We loved each other little, and, by the end, I knew him even less than that. Yet I can say for sure that his hatred for House Targaryen overruled everything else in his mind. There is a reason, Sir Davos, why Eddard Stark kept Jon Snow's birth a secret from my brother for all those years, and it was not for the safety of Robert nor the stability of the realm. If Eddard Stark felt he had to lie to his closest friend for the duration of Robert's reign, then I cannot be surprised that if others knew that they did likewise. What shall we do then? Nothing, Stannis said quietly, standing up straight and turning away from the table to cross over toward the window and gaze down at the harbor of Dragonstone. Montfort Valerian betrayed his king if he kept that secret from Robert, and he betrayed me. Yet, had I known, I would have been duty-bound to tell my brother. It is likely that in his treachery, regardless of how long he has known, Montfort Valerian has saved Jon Snow's life and countless others. One good deed does not wash out the bad, he said quietly. It does not, Stannis agreed. They settled into silence with both Cresson and Davos watching Stannis, who stood with his back to them, hands clasped behind him, and eyes fixed on the harbor. Get the castle ready, Cresson. Have your belongings packed alongside those belonging to mine, my wife's and my daughter's, Stannis murmured eventually. Ensure my daughter knows what is waiting for her in her future and she is prepared. Within the year I hope this war will be done and we will all be returning to Storm's End. Storm's End has a Maester, Cresson said quietly. I am bound to this keep, not to House Baratheon. It shall be my only request of this boy, King Stannis replied, turning to look at Cresson. Davos took a step back, feeling as though he was intruding on a deeply personal moment between the two of them, yet neither of them seemed to notice as Stannis continued, You have given me great counsel these years. Pylos is your replacement, is he not? He can stay here and serve on Dragonstone. Whichever Maester Renly currently has in Storm's End can stay there and serve as a Maester. You shall come with me. It was, he thought quietly, a mark of just how little Stannis was capable of speaking to his feelings that he knew precisely what the man was saying without the man having said it. He watched as Stannis flushed slightly, his face turning a dark red, and then he strode from the room without another glance at the two of them. Next to him, Cresson heaved out a deep breath and pulled out a chair and settled into it. I had not thought. Stannis recognizes value and loyalty where he sees it, he said quietly. I do not know much, but I know my lord. Cresson turned to look at him, glancing down at his hand. Yes, I suppose you do. 299 AC, Doran Martell. Brother. You were right to send me here. Our time has arrived, but I fear we are too late to take part. The game is already well into its second phase. Lady Olenna has proposed a match between Quentyn and Lady Desmara Redwyne and has offered them a keep. Lady Margaery is already well matched. I have accepted, for Elia. I ride north. Oberyn. His hands tightened around the edges of the scroll, crumpling it so deeply he feared he may not be able to read the words again. Father. He turned to look at Arianne, who sat patiently upright on the chaise chair next to him. Seconds before she had been lounging, as she always did. But she must have seen something in his face or posture to quickly change from being relaxed to alert. He held the note out to her wordless and then turned to Caloette, leave us. Caloette inclined his head deeply and then turned and left without another word, closing the door behind him with a quiet snap. He relaxed slightly, knowing that it was just him and Arianne now. He watched his daughter carefully as her eyes skimmed over the letter several times before she held it back out to him. He had not thought a mere moon ago they would be here together. That his daughter would sit with him willingly and that the bond between them might be able to be saved. Yet, once again, Oberyn had proved himself to be right about matters of the heart. Arianne had longed to reconcile, and so had he, and so they had. It was not as it had been when she was but a girl and had come crying to him whenever she was hurt, but it was improving. Slowly. What do you think? Uncle knew that Quentyn was not your heir, Arianne said, her voice curiously level and flat. It was the same tone she took when she was trying to bury her emotions, the exact tone Doran's mother had used. It made him nervous. He would not have acted unless he knew. You kept something from me. You are still keeping something from me. He twisted slightly in his chair to look at his daughter. We have done much, these last weeks, to fix the broken bonds between us, Arianne, he said quietly. I believe that I have reassured you enough that your position as my heir remains. However, the time has come to speak on the matter that led to your disquiet. I do not wish to speak on it, she said, her voice still flat. It was an error on my part. It was not, he said, his voice sharper than he intended. He sighed, dropping the note onto his lap and running a hand down his face. We were close once and I long to repair the bond between us. Knowing that you are confident in your place as my heir is not enough for me. I wish to make amends. I do not need to hear of it, Father, Arianne said again. Her voice was more forceful now, as though she was beginning to anger, and she half rose from her chair. I do, and I am your father, so you will listen, he continued, waving at her to sit back down. You believed I did not wish you as my heir, and I did not. I wished for you to be queen. Arianne froze, her mouth partly open and her eyes wide. Then she dropped back onto her chair and gazed at him steadily for a few moments. Prince Viserys, I presume, she said, her voice sharp. It would never be the Lannister children. Yes, he agreed. You did not tell me. You were too young, and it was not safe, he said carefully. I planned to tell you when you turned 6 and 10, but I worried you would have shared with your cousins, and much though I love them, they are not capable of keeping something like that to themselves. They would have not done it deliberately, I know, but they would have talked on it. Arianne pursed her lips and looked at him. For a moment he thought he saw his mother in her again, the spark that was ready to be lit to ignite a torrent of flames, but as quickly as the spark appeared, it vanished, and her gaze turned pensive. And now? We were made aware that another child of Rhaegar's lived, he murmured. A son with Lyanna Stark. A Jon Snow. That is the boy that makes the claim. The boy the rumors speak of. Yes. Arianne did not speak for a few moments and instead glanced away from him to gaze out the balcony doors. He watched her carefully, wondering what his daughter was thinking. There was a time where he would have known precisely what she thought the second she thought it. But those years were long gone now. Now he had to wait. The reports of the match between House Tyrell and the Starks will be true then, Arianne said quietly several minutes later. With House Tyrell, they will have the Reach and the Riverlands as well as the North. Why do you say that? Uncle would not have suggested a match between Olenna Tyrell's granddaughter and Quentyn unless it was the winning side, and he refers to Lady Margaery being well matched. The only match other than this boy that could be considered a good match is with the boy's family, Robb Stark. The rumors speak of that match, and rumors are often not without cause. You are correct, of course. He does not propose a match for me because I am to be your heir, she continued, as though he had not spoken. Jon Snow would not take me as his wife, so I shall not be queen. You will not wage war against him whilst he has the support of 3 of the 7 kingdoms. So, you will support him, as uncle requests. Yes. But we will not send Dornish spears, the war is too far gone already. By the time we mustered our banners, it would be over, uncle has made that clear, she pressed on. After? No. You would not risk a war with the Iron Throne whilst Quentyn is so vulnerable, and I think that uncle is telling you that he will support this boy. I would not, he agreed. I would not risk you nor your brothers. And he is. We had thought to support the boy until he was crowned and then decide what we wished to do, but it appears Lady Olenna has been quite persuasive. What shall you do? What would you have me do? I would have you leave this war alone. House Martell has lost too much to gamble with justice or vengeance, Ariane replied, her voice strong and sure. We do not need to betroth my brother to a red wine to get our justice. It shall come, but it need not be by our hands. I would summon uncle home. Is it justice if it is not by our hands? He asked. Your uncle would say it was not. Uncle is a fool, she murmured. Then she leaned forward and poured 2 large glasses of Dornish sour from the decanter on the table and held one out to him. I love uncle, as you do, she continued. But I would not see him die to get vengeance when the Lannisters and those that served them will be dealt with regardless of what we do. Your uncle would rather die than not secure vengeance for our sister. Ariane tutted quietly and took a small sip of her sour. Will you send Quentyn to Highgarden then? I shall. Quentyn will do well in the Reach and, regardless of the outcome of this war, it would be a wise match. We have not been one with Westeros for many years, he admitted, his voice soft. We are different. Proud. Yet, your uncle has ridden north. I am trapped here and so I must trust his judgment, as I always have. If this boy can unite the kingdoms, I would have us integrated into it. I would not have it said that we were cowards or weak, which is what they will say if I sit idly and do nothing. This act, it will cost us little but gain us much. It seems too good to be true. There is a catch, I am sure, he agreed. Yet your uncle counsels it. You rule Dorne, father, not Uncle Oberyn. He smiled sadly at her. You shall support the boy's claim whilst Viserys lives. She pressed on, her voice tight. Viserys' claim is not disputed. It appears I shall have no choice. You always have a choice, father. They gazed at each other for a few moments before she glanced away. You have much to learn still in the ways of managing the conflict between family and ambition, he mused quietly. Sometimes we must do things we find distasteful and chafe against because they are best for our house. He sighed and leaned forward to tilt her chin up so he could gaze into her eyes. Once their eyes were locked, his hand moved to her cheek. I have been remiss these last years. I have not taught you as I should, and I have not provided you the guidance you need. I have failed you in so many ways. It's not yet too late, but you are a woman now, so I will ask you rather than order you, will you let me teach you as I should have these last years? The smile she gave him was resplendent, and made her look far younger and softer than she had done in years. It took his breath away because, for one heartbreakingly short moment, she looked so like Elia and his mother that it made his chest ache. Her hand came up and she placed it against his. Yes. Chapter 24, Home. Chapter text. Chapter summary, Jon negotiates with Yohn Royce and Gunthor Grafton and then speaks to his brother. Daenerys and Viserys arrive at Driftmark whilst Varys finds an unlikely ally. In our interlude, Aemon and Jorah Mormont talk. 299 AC, Jon Snow. Lord Royce, Lord Gunthor, he said, standing as Lord Yohn and Lord Gunthor entered the room in Harrenhal that he had taken for his solar. My apologies for not speaking to you sooner. He crossed out from behind his desk and gestured to the comfortable chairs near the fireplace. Let us sit by the fire, this room grows chilly in the evenings, and I do not wish for any of us to freeze. Once the 2 lords were settled in their chairs and all 3 of them had mugs of ale, he leaned back and watched them closely. Both seemed relaxed, but he had learned from Aemon how deceptive appearances could truly be. Lady Catelyn said you wished to discuss pledging your allegiance, he began, his eyes flitting between the 2 men as he spoke. I will gladly take your pledges, but I will say this, I am not my grandfather. You need not pledge your loyalty because you believe it will spare your families from my supposed wrath when I win this war. I have no intention of burning your family alive because you did not fight alongside my armies. Lord Gunthor was less composed than Lord Royce and relaxed in front of Jon's eyes as soon as Jon had finished speaking. Lord Royce met his gaze with a pensive expression on his face and then leaned back in his chair. You sound like your father, Lord Royce said, his voice booming in the quiet of Jon's solar. Ned always spoke his mind. As will I, he promised. And I would ask that my bannermen do as well. A king who inspires fear is not one to be admired, nor is a king who cannot take fair comment from his lords. By the fireplace, Ghost let out a long stretch, drawing the attention of both men to him, and then curled up more tightly in a ball and returned to his sleep. Lady Arryn has declared that the Vale will take no part in the war to come, Yohn Royce said a few moments later. I believe she had considered mustering her banners for the Lannisters. Petyr Baelish has been whispering in her ear for moons now, but once your dragon was seen about Gulltown she decreed we would wait out the war. Yet you are here, he remarked quietly. I have already said that I would not take retribution if you did not partake in this war. This is not your fight. You can leave, Lord Royce, and I will keep to my word. The thought had crossed my mind, Lord Royce agreed, his voice as loud as it had been before. But I heard rumor that Lord Stannis Baratheon has agreed to support your claim. He raised an eyebrow. The lads at the docks in Gulltown heard parts of your conversation with Davos Seaworth. They believed he would persuade Lord Stannis to support your claim. And, on top of that, there is the matter of Lord Stannis currently sailing his fleet down to Storm's End. Given his lack of men, he either goes to join up with his brother and support his brother's claim, which seems unlikely, or more likely he goes to force his brother to make peace. He raised an eyebrow, unable to keep the surprise off his face that Stannis Baratheon had taken such actions. You seem very well informed, my lord. Dock hands talk, your grace, Lord Gunthor said, speaking before Lord Royce could. His voice was higher, that of a boy on the cusp of manhood, and more softly spoken than the other man's. And sailors speak loudest of all. If you went to the Lannisters with that information, you would be wealthy men. Yet here we are. Here you are, he agreed. He shifted slightly in his chair and took a long, slow sip of ale. I was not sure he would support my claim, but I am glad it appears he has. You say he sails for Storm's End. Lord Gunthor and Lord Royce nodded. He sighed. He does mean to reason with Renly then. That is one weight lifted from my shoulders, he murmured. Then he glanced down at his mug of ale and took another long sip. What are your terms in order for me to secure your support? It was Lord Gunthor who spoke first, his voice deepening as he grew more confident in his demands. My father sends this offer: House Grafton can field 10,000 knights. All we ask in return is that you take my youngest brother, Giles, as a squire when this war is done, and that you help us with Lysa Arryn. He considered the man carefully, then glanced at Lord Royce. And your terms, Lord Royce? 12,000 knights are yours. But I ask that if you must face Renly Baratheon on the field of battle, that you spare my second son's life, for he is most taken with Renly and won't leave the boy's side. And that you help us with Lysa Arryn. He raised an eyebrow. Both of your houses' wishes for my aid with Lady Catelyn's sister. I, and Lady Catelyn would agree, Lord Royce said. Her sister is sick. Her brain is addled. She treats that boy like he is a babe still, and yet she refuses to march for her own flesh and blood. And the boy? Weak, but not without hope, he is not yet a man. You wish to remove him from his mother. I cannot make that promise, he said carefully. But what I can say is when this war is over, and we head to the Vale, either to confront their armies or to discuss terms with Lady Arryn, I will speak to the boy myself and decide what is to be done. Very well, Lord Royce replied. How long will it take you to return to Rustone and Gulltown? 2 weeks' hard ride, your grace, Lord Gunthor replied. If we are able to change our horses often. Will your father trust a raven? He told me what to ride should you agree to our terms. And you, Lord Royce? Will your wife or sons know you speak true if you send a raven? He nodded to himself and leaned further back in his chair. We shall send a raven shortly to both Runestone and Gulltown. You shall then return home to muster your men and march toward Riverrun. Riverrun? He replied, leaning forward and placing his mug on the table. Then he rose to his feet and crossed the room to pull off the map from his desk, and then turned and headed back across the room to place it on the table in front of the two men. He sat down again and leaned forward to gaze at the map. I march on Riverrun, but I mean to persuade Lady Went and her servants to accompany us to Harroway's town before I leave. She is certain that the Lannisters will not seek to retake Harrenhal again, but I cannot take that risk, and I cannot leave her with a garrison. It will take 2 weeks, at least, for us to get to Harroway's town, given the speed at which we shall need to travel. If we are lucky, you and your men will rejoin us before we reach Riverrun to retake it from the Lannisters. And if you are not? Lord Royce asked, leaning forwards and not looking at Jon as he spoke. I still like my odds, he replied grimly. The Reach have mustered their forces as well. I do not know for sure where they mean to march, but wherever they go, it will mean Tywin Lannister has to scatter his forces to maintain his hold on Riverrun and face off against the Reach. Even if Tywin Lannister means to face us with the full might of his troops, his own would be decimated and, without reinforcements from the Vale or the Stormlands, he will not take that risk. And Dorne. You know as well as I do, Lord Royce, that Dorne will never muster its banners for a Lannister, he said, unable to stop the grimace that spread across his lips. He paused and glanced between the two men. I do not mean to cause offense, my lords, but I am surprised that the Blackfish is not with you. He went north, your grace. To Winterfell. To the Eyrie. To what end? He means to reason with Lady Lysa, Lord Gunthor replied, his voice tight. Yet you have asked me to reason with her, so you think his quest is doomed to fail? I, Lord Gunthor replied. But she is blood and even the Eyrie cannot withstand the might of a dragon. Very well, he murmured. He cast his eyes back down to the map and then moved his finger along it. You will come through the Bloody Gate on your return. It is faster than taking the route by the sea, despite the mountain clans, Lord Royce agreed. We must go past Iron Oaks on our return. Lady Waynwood has another 10,000 men. You wish to try and persuade her to my cause? He asked, glancing up to Lord Royce. If your grace agrees. And should you fail? He continued, his eyes flicking between the two men. When Lord Royce and Lord Gunthor shared a quick look, he sighed, no. Do not ask her to support my claim. I would rather your forces remained whole for the battles ahead. Very well, your grace. Is there anything else you need of me? He asked, rising to his feet and smiling down at the two men. One question, your grace, Lord Royce said, rising to his own feet and glancing down at Jon. When Jon gestured for him to continue, the man pressed on. Lady Catelyn was sure you did not have a dragon before you left for the Wall, yet, forgive me, it has been many years since I was in the Red Keep and saw the skulls of the dragons of old. But yours is far bigger than she ought to be for her age if she is young, and yet much smaller than she ought to be for her age if she is not. No forgiveness needed, my lord, he said, smiling as he began to walk toward the door of his solar. She is not yet a year old. Lord Royce stumbled slightly but righted himself quickly and brushed off both Jon and Lord Gunthor, who had gone to steady him. That young? Aye, he replied. She spent years in her egg at the Wall and much of her life either at the Wall or in Greywater Watch. The Neck is said by some to be the home of magic, Lord Gunthor said, when Lord Royce failed to speak. The Wall likewise. He nodded and smiled at the other man, remembering that House Grafton did not have the blood of the first men in their veins, who seemed slightly uncomfortable with the thought of magic being in this world. He pulled the door open when they arrived and bid Lord Gunthor a safe journey back to the Vale, and asked Lord Royce to linger for a moment. I wish to be clear, Lord Royce, that I am not looking for a wife, he said, once Lord Gunthor was slightly down the passageway and out of earshot. I know your eldest daughter is a similar age to me, and politically the match would be wise. But I will not take your men, nor march your sons to war, without being honest with you. Lord Yohn's eyebrows rose in surprise, then a wide smile spread over his face. Just like your father. Ned Stark would never lead a man astray. Do not fear, your grace, my men and sons come without caveat. Your father and Lady Catelyn say you will make a good king and, given the other choice, that is more than enough for me. Asterisk asterisk. He was still puzzling the parting words of Lord Yohn hours later when his brother found him leaning against Winter and watching as Lord Yohn and Lord Gunthor disappeared into the distance, their horses fresh and ready for the long ride ahead. There is something on your mind, Robb said, coming to stand near him. He glanced up in time to see his brother shiver slightly and sighed. He gestured for his brother to take a spot next to him, by Winter's side, and waited patiently whilst Robb steeled himself to do so. Lord Yohn Jon began carefully. He said Lady Catelyn said I would make a good king. He could not have spoken to her after I did, for I know that he was with Father and Daisy Mormont, so Lady Catelyn must have discussed me with him before she even arrived. Robb was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed in the distance where the forms of the two knights of the Vale had vanished into the woods, and then he heaved out a deep breath. Mother would have loved you. Pardon? He asked, turning to face his brother who was still staring at the woods as though they were providing him with the answers that Jon sought. I heard her talking to Father when you spoke to Lord Royce and Lord Gunthor, Robb continued, as though Jon had not spoken. She was so angry at him, John. So angry at the pain he brought on her, on you, on the family. I do not know if she will ever forgive him. That does not mean she would have loved me, he said quietly. We cannot know what she would have thought. She would have, Rob said gently, as though worried that John would take offense to his disagreement. I am not blind to mother's flaws. Polite phrasing, brother. But Rob continued, raising his voice, for all those flaws, and I am not blind to them, John, she loves her children. If she had known who your mother was and that father had not betrayed her, she would have cared for you. I am certain of it. You did not hear her speaking to father, I did. I can well believe that when she realized who your mother was, when the rumors began to circulate, and the ravens were sent, she re-examined all she thought she knew about you. She has had well over 2 moons to reconsider her views on you, brother. It is too late now, he said eventually, taking a step away from the warmth of Winter and not turning around to look at Rob as he spoke. The past is the past, Rob. We cannot dwell on what was and what might have been. Your mother knows now, and it is for her and father to resolve. I would ask that you do not hold the past against her. Rob tutted quietly, but did not move to stand next to him. It may be done, brother, but that does not change the fact that what happened will continue to shape our futures. You may find it easy to forget, but I cannot. Father robbed you of a mother the day he chose not to trust her. If there is one thing he has done in the last 6 and 10 years that I cannot forgive him for, it is that. You should have grown up loved, and she would have loved you if she had known. Mayhaps, he murmured. It is easier for her now, since the rumors of your birth drifted south, I believe, Rob continued quietly. She can recognize you for who you are. The qualities she did not like in you before, or imagined she did not like, are the qualities she likes now. Honor. Duty. Family. Loyalty. Careful, brother, or I may think you have been listening in on more than one conversation that you should not have been privy to. Does it matter? You should know what mother thinks of you, Rob replied. She would have loved you, John. How can you forget or forgive the past that was robbed from you by father? Behind him, he heard Winter grumble and shift slightly, as though to make her opinion on the matter known. He turned slightly to look at his brother and at Winter. Both met his gaze, one at a time, and he shivered at the grief in both of their faces. I cannot forget it, he said quietly. But if things had been different and your mother had treated me as her own, then I would never have gone to the wall and I would never have met my uncle nor hatched Winter. Winter let out a low croon, as though understanding why he was so reluctant to grieve the past, and lifted her head slightly to peer more closely at him. You think it was worth it? How could I not? He whispered, eyes still fixed on Winter. In the distance, he could hear Ghost howling and knew, instinctively, that his direwolf was coming back from his hunt with Grey Wind. He didn't turn though, he kept his gaze on his dragon, who was blinking up at him languidly with wide, white eyes, a softness to the scales around her face that he had never seen before. Look at her, brother, and tell me you would not feel the same. ***. 2 days later, as the sun began to crest behind the hills in the distance, he watched, hundreds of feet high in the air, as 12,000 Northern and Riverlands troops began to march out of Harrenhal. In the middle of the caravan was a huge, if a tad too ostentatious, wheelhouse where Lady Went, Lady Caitlin, and several of the female servants were sequestered. It had been a hard-won argument that had, finally, persuaded Lady Went to leave her home and instead take refuge in Harroway's Town, and he could not help but think that Lady Caitlin had ultimately had something to do with Lady Went changing her mind. For now, they rode north toward Lord Harroway's Town, where 200 men, alongside Lady Went and her servants, would remain under the command of Lord Root whilst the rest of the army pressed on toward Riverrun. When they left Harroway's Town, Lady Caitlin would swap the wheelhouse for a horse and undertake the remainder of their journey on foot. Winter banked sharply left just as a swarm of ravens, loosed only a few moments earlier from below them, flew underneath her and toward the north. He watched them go, feeling more apprehension than he had felt before. It had taken a lot for him to trust Lady Caitlin enough to allow her to sign her name next to his on the scrolls that now wended their way north, not because he could not trust her, but rather because it felt uncomfortable to trust her given their history. Yet, he could not help but think that if there was anyone who could persuade people to support his cause, it would be Lady Caitlin. Underneath him, Winter let out a loud roar as the last of the army began to leave the ruined castle below them. He could hear thousands of hooves as horses pranced down the road and the chink of thousands of pieces of armor as the men of his army moved together in unison. Svegon, Winter, he called, smiling grimly as her wings flapped forcefully once and propelled them forward a dozen feet with ease. He could feel her glee through the bond as she soared above their army and toward their next battle. 299 AC, Daenerys Targaryen. Driftmark was beautiful. She knew that Viserys wished they had stopped at Dragonstone, and she had likewise wished they had stopped there, but her desire was far more muted than her brother's. Whilst she had been born there, she had little memory of it, unlike Viserys, who could clearly remember fondly his time there before the rebellion, and so the pull to go there was less. He had spoken to her of the smell of salt and ash and how cold it could become when a breeze whipped up, and though she longed to see it, she could not help but think her future did not lay at Dragonstone. Driftmark was larger than Dragonstone, but that was not what drew her in. Instead, it was the tall mountains, the fertile grassland where she knew her Dothraki could let their horses run for hours at a time, and the smell of fresh salt water in the air that made her think she was home. Next to her, she could feel Oren tense slightly as the ship pulled up alongside the docks, but he did not say anything, and so she did not either. Together they stood there watching as the ship dropped anchor and the gangway was lowered, and as one by one the crew of the ship disembarked with fond farewells and promises that they would see Oren at the tavern below the castle later that day. "It is quiet," Oren murmured eventually, his voice far quieter than it needed to be given just how empty the docks were. "There should be more ships here. Far more." Then he drew himself up straight and said, "Come. Maester Gerard will be waiting." She barked out orders to the Dothraki to go with Daenerys and that she would look for them later, then she trotted off the ship after Oren with her son clasped tightly in her arms. Behind her she could just hear Viserys say something to Doriaire, and then the heavy footsteps on the gangway that confirmed he was following her. Oren did not wait for her, nor Viserys and Ser Jorah, to catch up with him. Instead, he strode off, down the docks, and then turned sharply right, taking a path that seemed to loop around the small town outside the keep. She followed him, her eyes moving backward and forward as she tried to take in as much as she could. The dwellings of the town were like nothing she had seen before, utterly different to both the Dothraki tents but also the whitewashed stones of the manses in Pentos and the rest of Essos. The walls of both the small folk dwellings and the castle above them were dark. But they were not uniformly dark, but rather salt-washed, as though stained by centuries of salt and grime. She sucked in a deep breath, then instantly regretted it, as the air closer to the castle tasted like ash and sulfur, and hastily tucked Rhaego closer to her chest. They walked in silence for several moments, circumventing the town until they were under the shadows of the walls that encircled Driftmark. Oren suddenly stopped walking as the path vanished in front of them. "Now we wait," he said quietly. "Why did you bring us this way?" She turned slightly to glance at her brother. His eyes were harsher than they had been in moons, and his hand was on the pommel of his sword as though he expected to be attacked. As Daenerys watched, he took half a step forward so he was slightly ahead of her. Behind him, Ser Jorah likewise tensed. Because walking through the town would be foolish. Hundreds of people live there, your dragons may still be at sea for the moment, but there is no hiding you as Targaryens, despite the number of dragon seeds here and on Dragonstone. The crew know to keep their mouths shut, the small folk do not, Oren replied, his eyebrows raising slightly. He sighed loudly and raised his hand to show he held no weapons. "Take your hand off the sword, Prince Viserys." Behind Viserys, Ser Jorah heaved out a deep breath and his own posture relaxed slightly. "Oh dear," a quiet voice said. "Your timing is as unfortunate, as always." She spun around. Behind Oren, leaning heavily against the wall as though he had run to them, was an old frail man with wispy white hair and heavy chains. "A maester." "Gerard," Oren said, his voice vibrant and full of joy, as though he were greeting an old friend. She watched as Gerard heaved out several deep breaths and then panted out, "Prince Viserys, Princess Daenerys, a pleasure to meet you." He swooped into a low bow, still panting, and then straightened. "Why is my timing so unfortunate?" "Because your brother left not 2 weeks ago with Lord Stannis Baratheon and his armies to go to Storm's End. He means to root out Renly." Gerard shook his head. "He means to ally with him. Lord Stannis has relinquished his own claim to the throne and has announced his support for Jon Snow. He sails to Storm's End to reason with his brother and make him stand down. ****. The solar that Montfort Valerian had claimed for himself, and then apparently relinquished and declared to be his brother's, was a cozy room despite it seeming to be completely unused. There was a roaring fire in the fireplace and lots of candles burning low. Oren threw himself ungracefully down sideways into a chair near the roaring fireplace, not even turning around and waiting for the rest of the group to enter the room. He threw his legs over one side of the chair and stretched languidly. "By the gods, I have missed this," he murmured, seeming to be completely focused on the comfort the chair provided and forgetting anyone else existed. She crossed the room, Roygo clasped in her arms, and took a careful seat opposite him and near the fire. Viserys and Ser Jorah did likewise, and all three of them turned to watch as Maester Gerard spoke to a servant near the door before he too joined them in the chairs by the fire. "This Jon Snow," Viserys said, breaking the silence between them, "he is our nephew. Rhaegar's son. Hidden in the north as the bastard child of Ned Stark," Maester Gerard said quietly. "He has come forward to claim the throne. We heard rumors someone had been spotted riding a dragon over Gulltown," Viserys continued, his body angled towards Maester Gerard. "True. How?" she breathed. "How can his dragon be big enough to ride?" "We do not know," Maester Gerard replied. "But Davos Seaworth, one of Stannis Baratheon's men, swears blind that the boy rode the dragon. Is that why Stannis Baratheon has sworn his support for Jon Snow? He threatened him." She glanced at her brother, unable to ignore the fact he kept referring to their nephew by his full name, but Viserys pointedly ignored her. "No," Maester Gerard said quietly, his eyes soft as he spoke. "Apparently, the boy simply said that with his dragon he would win the war. He allegedly had the support of the North, the Riverlands and the Reach already. It means he has the largest armies, even without Lord Stannis, Lord Renly and their men, and he has the grain. And Stannis Baratheon just offered his support. He had his own claim. Jon Snow offered him the title of Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, a place for any man Lord Stannis chose on the small council, and promised Lord Stannis a place by his side in the wars to come. Does he not have a daughter?" she asked, speaking quickly before Viserys could. "Surely a match would have been a more attractive proposition." "Lady Shireen is Lord Stannis' heir," Gerard said softly. "She belongs in Storm's End. Is Renly not his heir?" "Renly will sire no children, of that you can be assured." "How do you know all this?" "Lord Montfort was summoned to Dragonstone along with the rest of the lords of the Narrow Sea, and he may have overheard a snippet of conversation between Lord Stannis and Sir Davos Seaworth." "You mean he eavesdropped?" "To ensure that Lord Stannis had no intentions of betraying Rhaegar's heir, of course," Maester Gerard replied, his voice offering no apologies. "He then returned to corral his men and told me of what he heard so I could, in turn, inform you when you arrived." They lapsed into a long silence then, no one speaking as the sun began to set slightly outside, as they all lost themselves in their own thoughts. Next to her, she could almost hear Viserys' mind as it ran through the possibilities. She started slightly when a servant brought in food and drinks for them, but no one rose to take any of the offerings that were placed on the desk near the window. A few minutes later, she glanced towards the window when she felt her dragons appear. They perched on the open window frame and gazed inside sadly at her, as though wishing for nothing more than her comfort after weeks at sea but knowing they should not enter. "He has done it then," Viserys breathed at last. "With the Four Kingdoms he has won. He could march directly on King's Landing. He does not know for sure he has Lord Stannis' support, so he does not know that he has won," Maester Gerard said quietly. "Lord Stannis sent word via code to Riverrun, but the last we knew, Jon Snow marched on Harrenhal." "Harrenhal?" "Lady Went's home was taken by the Mountain and his men." She felt her shoulders tighten slightly. In her arms, Roygo let out a snuffle, as though sensing how uncomfortable she was, and she half expected him to open his eyes and cry, but instead he seemed to fall asleep again as he burrowed into her warmth. "He must be told that you have arrived as well," Maester Gerard continued, after a brief pause. "But I would not trust the word of a raven." "I will go," Viserys said immediately. "Viserys?" "No, Dany," Viserys murmured, turning to look at her. His eyes softened slightly as he met her gaze. "I shall go. I shall go with him," Oren said, raising his own eyes from the fireplace and sitting up straight in his chair so he was no longer sprawled across it. "We shall head north, to Gulltown and go through the Vale. It will be the safest route if they have not yet declared for a side. This is folly, Ser Jorah said quietly, speaking for the first time. We cannot have the heir to the king and the king both marching around Westeros when it is at war. You should stay here, my prince. Oren and I shall go. She watched as Viserys flinched slightly when he was referred to as heir, but then her brother threw back his shoulders and sat tall in his chair. Do not presume to give me orders, Ser Jorah. Leave us, she whispered, her voice firm and her eyes fixed back on her brother. Princess Oren began quietly. Leave us, she snapped. Oren sighed and gestured with his fingers for Ser Jorah to rise. They left the room, only after giving her a long look and Viserys an even longer one. Maester Gerard lingered for a moment before he whispered, Montoris will wish to see you, Lord Montfort's son, he is in the village with his scepter at the moment. I shall tell him to expect you both at dinner. She glanced away from her brother toward the Maester, who met her eyes with a stern look, making it clear that he would not budge on this, and she found herself nodding back. He smiled at her and then glanced at her brother, Prince Viserys, Princess Daenerys, it truly is a pleasure to have you here. Then he turned and left them alone. You are angry, Viserys said quietly, immediately after the door had shut behind the Maester. Furious, she breathed. This is a foolish mission. Tell me, do you truly wish to die so much, brother? Dany, do not wake the dragon. No, Viserys, she hissed. You do not get to tell me what to do, and you do not get to charge off into a war when we do not know who our allies are. You wish to prove yourself or seek redemption. You are being selfish. I'm doing it for you. You are doing it for yourself, she spat. Perhaps you even hope that our nephew will die on the field of battle, and you can claim his armies for yourself. I am not. I do not. Viserys spat, rising to his feet, taking half a step toward her and raising his hand as though to strike her. On the balcony, her dragons let out an angry chirp and Viserys froze instantly. Dany, he pleaded, dropping his hand. I am doing this for you. We must know what is happening on the mainland, and we cannot sit out this war and just wait for Jon Snow to reclaim the Iron Throne. You are trying to prove yourself, she hissed, taking a step toward him until her chest was touching his. You cannot leave me. I forbid it. I need to do this, Dany, he whispered. Please. Why? She snapped. When Viserys did not immediately reply, she sighed and leaned forward in her chair. Tell me the truth. I want to meet him first so I can make sure he's worthy of our support, Viserys murmured eventually, turning his eyes on her. She blinked when she realized they were wet, but did not speak and instead waited for him to continue. He sat back down heavily in his chair, hunched in on himself, and took a moment before he continued. I want to know that, when he meets you and Rhaego, he'll protect you better than I did. I want to know I have not made another mistake. I can't lose you, Dany. Not after everything I have done. And if you die, then I will have tried. She sighed and leaned back heavily against her chair. You do not need to prove yourself to me, Viserys. I need to do it for me. 299 AC, Varys. It was not often that he could admit to being wrong, and yet, he had been wrong. He had expected this war to be messy and bloody, as war was wont to be. He had expected to need to move swiftly, in indelicate, truly ugly and possibly despicable ways, in order to try and bring a quick and clean end to the war. Yet, he was not needed. Daenerys and Viserys were on Driftmark, at least for now, and rumored to both be supporting their nephew's claim, although he remained skeptical as to Viserys' motives given the reports he had received on the boy. Jon Snow had taken Harrenhal and, if rumors were to be believed, he had the Reach, two of the strongest houses of the Vale, the North and the Riverlands clamoring to support him. Dorne was silent, and yet Prince Oberyn was abroad, last spotted in Highgarden. That had surprised him. He had not truly expected the Viper to take the action he had. He had hoped, of course, but he had not expected it. And, on top of that, he had managed to secure the support, Varys could not say loyalty, of Stannis Baratheon. It seemed to be perfect. It made him worried. Dragons have been dead for 100 years, Joffrey said, his voice quiet, as he finally broke the silence that had settled over the small council following Petyr Baelish's update of the rumors that were circulating around King's Landing. It was the quietness of it that worried Varys more than anything else. Joffrey was unpredictable, insane, even, and prone to flying off into a temper. It was rare he was quiet or measured. "Yes, my king," Pycelle murmured when it became clear that no one would speak. "This cannot be true. Northern lies. To what purpose?" Cersei snapped, her hand clasped tight around her goblet and her face white. He didn't reply and instead watched as arguments broke out between Petyr Baelish and Pycelle as they tried to one-up each other to secure favor. Eventually, he sighed when it became clear they were not going to stop unless someone else spoke. "If I may, Your Grace," he tittered, looking at Joffrey with a carefully placid expression. When Joffrey lazily raised a hand at him, he continued, "Lord Stannis has sailed to Storm's End where his brother Renly has garrisoned with thousands of men. He is your uncle by blood. Request his aid. He deserted us and declared himself king." "Of course, Your Grace," he murmured. "But Lord Stannis could have 50,000 men at his command by the end of this moon." Joffrey opened his mouth and closed it again. He glanced at his mother and then spat out, "He decreed foul things about me, spider." "He did, Your Grace," he agreed. "Yet, if the rumors are true that the boy in the north has a dragon, then he will soon secure the support of the Targaryen loyalists, and I am sorry to say, Your Grace, that they number many." "How many?" Joffrey replied sharply, sitting up straight and his eyes flashing. "How many traitors?" "Many, Your Grace," he replied, feigning apology in his tone. He took a moment to consider how best to phrase his next words and then said cautiously, "If you were to show leniency and grace to Lord Baratheon, perhaps a match between Lady Shireen and your brother, I am sure that you would secure his support. House Baratheon, with the blood of House Targaryen in their veins, united against the northern invaders, it has a nice story behind it." "And you believe I need a story?" He paused, knowing he had to tread carefully, and resisted the urge to lick his lips. "The people love a good story. They love having something, or someone, to rally behind. If you have the small folk, you have won this war." The king forgiving his uncle for treachery, for not spilling blood, and being merciful enough to ally with that uncle and wed his brother to his cousin, a scarred little girl, after all that her father has done. Across from him, Tyrion Lannister leaned forward and took a deep swig of his Arbor Gold. "Lord Varys is right. We should offer terms to the Vale as well. I can attest to there being no love between Lady Catelyn and her sister. The Vale is within our grasp. Tell me, brother, do you plan to offer another of my children so easily? To keep the throne? I'd offer myself if I thought it would make a difference. Myrcella will not go to the Eyrie. She does not need to," Tyrion said cheerfully. "We need only promise. Like we need only promise to wed Tommen to Shireen." He watched Joffrey as Cersei and Tyrion bickered, their voices growing louder and louder, but it was easy to blot them out. Joffrey's face was, possibly, one of the most beautiful things that Varys had ever seen. The emotions whipping across his face went from furious, to curious, to furious, then back to curious before they flitted to thoughtful, and then a half-second of malice before they went back to curious again. "Do you think the rumors of the dragon are true, Lord Varys?" "Yes, Your Grace," he replied, immediately. Instantly, Cersei and Tyrion fell silent as their gazes whipped away from where they had been glaring at each other on rest on him. He did not look at them though, instead his gaze remained on Joffrey. "You are sure?" "I am," he replied. "What is more, Your Grace, I have reason to believe that Daenerys and Viserys Targaryen have recently arrived in Westeros and have 3 more dragons." "What?" "I have received several independent reports, including one just this morn that the dragon exists. Jon Snow has taken Harrenhal, rooted out the Lannister troops within it, and marches on Riverrun." "Not King's Landing?" "No, he goes to Riverrun, Your Grace." "Why did you not bring news to me of Harrenhal before?" "I only learned of it this morning, Your Grace. I have spent all day trying to ascertain the truth of these rumors, but now I believe they must be true given Lord Baelish has brought his own rumors to this small council," he replied, carefully letting his voice drop whenever he said the word rumor to emphasize how he had not wanted to worry the boy needlessly. "Based on the information provided by my little birds, I believe that the attack happened not 2 weeks ago." ****. He was not surprised later that night, long after the sun had fully set and the only light was that of flicking torches in brackets and candles in windows, when Tyrion Lannister entered his chambers without knocking with a large goblet in one hand and a book under the other. Tyrion did not so much as look at him as he dropped the book unceremoniously onto the desk and then exited through the door that led to the balcony. He sighed and followed. They stood in silence for a while, Varys purposefully not speaking and instead waiting for Tyrion to say what he needed to, watching the city below them. "I met the boy, you know," Tyrion said, breaking the silence between them. He took a long swig from his goblet and then continued, as though Varys could not possibly have guessed who the imp was referring to. "Jon Snow. What did you think of him?" he asked, unable to stop the slight interest that leaked into his voice. He did not trust people, but he did trust Tyrion Lannister's judgment on other people. He had heard, through his little birds, that Jon Snow was said to be as honorable as his father and as dutiful as Lady Catelyn, a wonder given the circumstances, and that he had treated Lady Went with more respect than men twice his age. Yet his little birds were young and fallible. Tyrion Lannister, for all his many flaws, was not a novice when it came to judging others. A good boy. He has potential, I think. Whether or not that would make him a good king remains to be seen, Tyrion muttered eventually. Some with potential excel even the highest of expectations. I suppose they do, Tyrion replied, his tone mournful. He will. I told him not to swear to the wall. He didn't deserve to die there. And now we're all going to die. Tyrion paused and went to take a deep swig of wine from his goblet and then glared at it when it became apparent it was empty. He sighed loudly and glanced up at Varys. "You are here for a reason, Lord Tyrion," he said finally, looking down at his companion. "I can assure you, no little birds or informants can access my chambers. We're going to lose this war." "That remains to be seen," he replied carefully. "As far as I am aware, Jon Snow only has the north and the Riverlands. His dragon is young and the rumored dragons of Daenerys and Viserys are even younger. They can be killed. He'll secure the Reach if he has not done so already, which I believe he has," Tyrion muttered glumly. "You were wise not to bring the rumors of Margaery Tyrell's marriage to Robb Stark to my nephew's attention. Unverified rumors serve no place in a war." "We both know they are true," Tyrion returned, glancing down at his goblet as though it might provide the answer to his unasked questions. "He has the Riverlands, the Reach and the North. He may well secure the Vale even if he does not secure House Arryn. We will be lucky, and I do not think we are, if the Dornish do not come to his aid for no other reason than to see us suffer. We have lost before the war even began." "You did not raise it either," he replied a few moments later, carefully ignoring the rest of Lord Tyrion's words and focusing instead on the marriage between Margaery Tyrell and Robb Stark. "It would do no good and it wouldn't change what is coming for us," Tyrion muttered bitterly. "My sister does not know yet. She may not learn until it is too late. I hope for all our sakes she does not lean anytime soon." "Do you think the boy capable?" "Too capable." "You like Jon Snow," he said a few moments later. It was hard not to like the boy. "You like him more than Joffrey." "It is hard not to like anyone more than Joffrey. Some days I like my own father more than Joffrey." "What do you require of me?" "You served House Targaryen for years, Lord Varys," Tyrion said finally, turning his gaze back to the city beneath them. "You will have been watching this boy for moons, I am sure. Tell me, what do you think will happen to House Lannister when he comes for us?" "I cannot presume to know, my lord," he began carefully. "But his father is Ned Stark. I believe that tells us all we need to know for now. You are watching him." "I am." "Will you tell me if I need to push more forcefully to remove Tommen and Myrcella?" "I will." "Thank you." They settled into another long silence. He purposefully did not look at the dwarf but kept his gaze on the city below them, knowing that Lord Tyrion had more he wished to say. "It is a strange thing that dragons had not breathed our air for over a century, and now there are 4," Tyrion said eventually, his voice soft. "One could almost be forgiven for thinking there is more at play." "But not you." "Not me," Tyrion agreed. "I thought thinking was what you were best at." "And fucking." "Thinking and fucking." He hummed thoughtfully and glanced down at his companion, meeting the man's slightly embarrassed gaze, before he lifted his head again to look out at the city. "My apologies, that was inconsiderate," Tyrion mused. "It was." They settled into a slightly uncomfortable, and heavy, silence as they both fixed their eyes on the city below them and watched as, one by one, fires began to go out as the small folk of King's Landing went to sleep. He sighed internally as a breeze swept past them but did not move other than to put his hands into his sleeves. "What shall you do?" "As I have always done, my duty to the realm," he replied. "Somehow, that does not fill me with confidence." Interlude, 299 AC, Aemon Targaryen. He glanced up when the door to his chambers opened and Lord Commander Mormont walked in, hastily shutting the door behind him to keep out the blizzard outside. "How is the First Ranger?" Exhausted Joa replied, crossing the room and sticking his hands into the flames to warm them up. "He is asleep, I had to order him to rest." "That does not sound like Benjen." "You did not see him, Aemon. He looked half mad when he rode through the gate." "He'd lost his fucking sword and his fingers were turning blue," Joa replied, glancing over his shoulder to look at Aemon. "You should have brought him to me," he muttered, half rising from his chair. "Sit down, Aemon, Benjen Stark is fine. He is as stubborn as my damn sister, but he is fine. He will live and then he will give us the report." He hummed thoughtfully as he sat down and then leaned forward to pick a blanket up from his bed and wrap it tightly around him. "He lost his sword. I was mumbling about dead men walking and wildlings and Mance Rayder. Seemed to be as mad as he looked. Benjen Stark is many things, but he is not mad." "I agree." "So, he saw or witnessed something?" "I believe so. Whether we can do anything about it is another thing," Joa replied. Then he sighed and turned to face Aemon fully. "You've been a man of the Night's Watch longer than I have been alive, what do you think is out there?" "I do not know," he replied quietly, his eyes flicking to the fireplace where he could feel the now familiar tugging from the egg in the flames. "But whatever it is, something is coming for us, Lord Commander." "You think Benjen speaks true?" "I think Benjen Stark is the best ranger that the wall has seen in 100 years," he said finally, wrenching his eyes away from the fireplace to look at his friend. "If he said he saw dead men, then I believe him. And there is the small matter of 3 good men vanishing and the increased number of wildlings that have been coming south." "By dead men, I believe he meant the others," Joa said a few moments later. "You know those histories, Aemon, and you know as I do why we are here. To guard the realms of men. The men will never accept anything that jeopardizes the South or the history they believe they know. We shall need to speak to Benjen when he wakes up." "I know. And the wildlings. You wish for my counsel, already?" "Yes. You will not like it." "I never have." He smiled. "They are as human as you or I men. Who are we to decide who lives and dies?" "We are not gods," he replied. "Difficult decisions will have to be made in the coming moons and years, Lord Commander. Some will want you to decide, but that is not your place anymore, not if Benjen Stark speaks true. Some would argue that the wall and our duty to it means I do have the right to decide. I do not think my nephew would agree with you. He is not king yet." Yet. Chapter 25, Acceptance. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary, Oren begins to understand Viserys. Garland encounters Oberyn. Stannis meets Renly. Notes, Award Season. Firstly, this is not a plug for my fics. I don't believe in asking for votes and I am incredibly lucky that my stories garner a lot of support and engagement. But not all writers are as lucky and most of them are far more talented than me. Personally, I think award season is a great opportunity to, a, show some love to authors who are underappreciated, either because they write niche pairings, or they just, for whatever reason, don't get lots of engagement, and give them the confidence boost that they might not necessarily get from kudos or comments, and, b, to have a nosy at some of the fics that others have nominated. The mods on r/Asoy of fanfiction are running their yearly end-of-year awards. If you follow the link it'll take you to a page with details of how to vote. Secondly, a much shorter chapter this time, with no interlude, as I am expecting the next chapter to be chunky as we near Riverrun. Enjoy. 299 AC, Oren Waters. He didn't like Viserys Targaryen and, now they were alone, he didn't bother to hide it either. He had tried to be civil, for the Sake of Daenerys, who he had truly begun to view as a friend, but in truth he could barely stand the sight of the man. The only reason he had volunteered to accompany the man to Gulltown was to ensure he did not do anything foolish, such as trying to kill his nephew or trying to split support and get backers for his own claim. It felt like a fool's errand though, for he could not believe Viserys was so much changed in a few short moons that Oren could stop him should he try to do anything to challenge Jon Snow's claim. Yet, he still boarded the ship to Gulltown. The first day into their voyage, he had completely ignored the man who had seemed unbothered by Oren's clear distaste for him. Instead, Viserys Targaryen had stood at the stern of the ship and fixed his gaze on Driftmark until the island was long gone from view. It wasn't until that evening that Viserys even moved from his spot, taking a meal on deck by himself and then retiring to their shared quarters. He didn't speak a word all day to anyone. On the second day, Viserys did not rise until the mid-morning, and when he did, he approached Oren on deck and simply said, "I watched you and Ser Jorah spar. Spar with me." It was on the tip of Oren's tongue to tell the man to fuck off. He didn't take orders from him, but instead, he nodded. They sparred on the deck of the ship for hours. Viserys was terrible, truly awful. His form was good, and he was quick on his feet, when he managed to actually move, but he seemed uncoordinated and often went the wrong way. But far too often he hesitated before he moved. More often than not, he would trip over his own feet and nearly hurt himself in the process of trying to dodge a lunge from Oren. It took a while, but, eventually, Oren realized that Viserys was second-guessing himself, and that was the cause of all his errors in his form and performance. He didn't say anything though, and they didn't share a single word all day and went to bed in their shared quarters without so much as looking at each other once they stopped their spar. On the third day, it was he who approached the other man and offered Viserys the training sword, handle first, and then spun away to take up position ready for a spar. A flicker of a smile ghosted across Viserys' face but was gone so quickly that Oren was half convinced he had imagined it. They ate their dinner side by side that night, not talking, but not alone, unlike the first 2 nights. The next day, he stopped Viserys several times as they sparred and corrected small slights of form. On the 5th day, Viserys managed to knock Oren's sword from his hand. Instead of the man crowing, which in truth Oren had more than expected and was fully prepared to bite his tongue to avoid being rude, Viserys simply bent down, picked up the training sword and offered it back, handle first, to Oren without a single word. By the 6th day, they had progressed to short conversations, stiflingly awkward and uncomfortable for both of them, that mostly focused on where they would go once they arrived in Gulltown and what Viserys hoped to achieve in the Vale. By the morn of the 10th day of their journey, Oren felt he understood Viserys better than he had ever expected. It wasn't that they had shared words, because truly they had barely really spoken, but just the act of spending time in each other's company and having to watch Viserys as the man sparred with him meant that Oren had begun to understand him on some level. He couldn't say he understood him fully, but he thought he had enough of an understanding that he could see why Daenerys was so intent on saving her brother if she could. Gulltown was just a dot on the horizon, and he knew from experience they would be there by the noon, for the wind was good and the tide strong, and so, after several days of wondering how best to make his approach to Viserys, he joined the man at the bow of the ship. "My father, on the death of his wife, in the birthing bed, fathered me that same night, they say," he said, speaking before Viserys could. "My mother died in childbirth 9 moons to the day after his wife. 2 women dead and only one of them had a child who lived. He kept me. Montford and I shared chambers for years, even though we were nearly 5 years apart. It is a terrible thing to come into the world knowing that your birth is what killed your mother. Daenerys and I are much the same in that regard. But there is one difference between us: she and you share a mother and Montford and I do not. How different my life might have been if Montford's mother had been mine. Montford loved me from the day he met me, and I have never had cause to question that. But if my birth had killed his mother, if we had been full siblings, if we did not have a father, I do not think he could have been so kind. I could not have been, if the roles had been reversed, regardless of the fault not being the babe's." "She didn't mean to," Viserys said eventually, moments after spending the intervening minutes opening and closing his mouth as war seemed to be raging on his face. "I know that. Yet you blame her nonetheless." They did not speak again for the rest of the day, not even when they docked at Gulltown, descended onto the docks and wrangled horses and supplies from the small folk. They rode in silence that day, and the day that followed. Oren half thought that, perhaps, he had misjudged Viserys. Yet there was a larger part of him that thought Viserys just needed someone to wait, to truly listen to him and his grief in a way that Daenerys could not. In a way that he would not let Daenerys listen. He had heard them talk of their mother and he knew that, despite what Daenerys though, Viserys had held back his grief. They made camp those 2 nights without saying a word other than Viserys offering to take the first watch, not that Oren slept whilst Viserys was on watch. Instead, he half slept in his saddle as they rode during the day. They took their breaks without talking and they ate without talking. They did not even spar. Halfway through the 3rd day of their ride from Gulltown to Runestone, he opened his mouth to try and break the stifling silence that had settled between them. Before he could get half a word out, an ear-splitting shriek broke through the silence around them. He glanced up, recognizing the noise instinctively, and was unsurprised to see a small dragon circling high above them. Although at this distance he could not be sure which one he was confident that, of all 3 of the dragons, it would be Aerion who had come. Aerion, Viserys breathed. "You are sure, Viserys?" he said, immediately regretting the familiarity of which he had spoken, because it was hard not to after so many days in just the man's company, whether or not they were talking. Viserys opened his mouth, presumably to correct Oren for not calling him Prince Viserys, and then closed it again with a quiet snap. Then he nodded. "I am sure." "I thought you had told him to stay behind," he replied. "I did." Above them, the dragon let out another belch of fire as it swooped down. It was bigger now. Oren had not seen Aerion up close for nearly a moon, given Viserys' dragon was far less friendly than Jaerion, who, Rhaego appeared to have claimed, or Balerion, although calling Balerion friendly was a slight stretch given all the dragon ever did was puff smoke in people's faces. The green and bronze dragon, with his green and red flames, was the size of a large dog now. Yet that did not seem to bother Viserys as the dragon landed just ahead of him and then let out another belch of fire and waited patiently for his master to bestow affection on him. Viserys dismounted his horse and hastily handed the reins to Oren, who took them without comment. He watched as Viserys hurried toward his dragon and kneeled in front of him, running a reverent hand down the dragon's neck as the beast leaned into his touch and cooed like a baby bird. He glanced away, giving the 2 a moment to themselves, and tried to ignore Viserys' whispered words in High Valyrian that were so soft and gentle that it was hard to imagine them coming out of the man's mouth. Eventually, there was a roar and he turned in time to see Aerion launch himself back into the sky with a few flaps of his wings. "He does not seem pleased," he remarked once Viserys had walked back to him. "He is angry that I left him behind," Viserys replied, taking the reins back from Oren and glancing up at the sky with a flat expression on his face. "Father once said that even our ancestors could not truly control their dragons." "Perhaps the one piece of advice your father gave that was right," he replied in an undertone, although slightly louder than he had expected it to come out. He paused, but he needn't have worried, for Viserys simply let out a thoughtful sound and carried on watching his dragon. "He will not land again today, but he has agreed, I believe, to keep watch as we ride," Viserys said quietly, climbing back on his horse with a wince and settling into the saddle. Together they kicked their horses forward through the undergrowth and back onto the path that would take them to Runestone and from there the road to the Bloody Gate. He kept half an eye on their surroundings and half an eye on Viserys, who appeared to be lost in thought. Above them the sun beat heavily down, but Aerion's shadow gave them brief moments of respite whenever he hovered above them. "My father was quite mad, wasn't he?" Viserys said quietly, hours later as they dismounted their horses, tethered them to a nearby stump and prepared to make camp for the night. "Yes. Do I look like him?" "I did not see your father at the end, Prince Viserys." "Your brother did though, I am sure he would have told you of him." "Do I look like him, Oren?" "You did," he admitted. "But not anymore." He shook his head and did not speak for a moment as he carefully arranged stones around the wood that would act as kindling for their fire. He moved back slightly and glanced at the dragon in the corner of their clearing, who looked between him and Viserys with bright, beautiful eyes. "Dracarys," Viserys murmured. Once the fire was lit and they were snacking on their dried meats and slightly mouthy apples, he said, "When I first met you, I thought you were your father reborn." He glanced at Viserys, who had paled slightly but was looking determinedly at him. "You looked insane. Your eyes were frenzied and darting about V's Dothrak as though looking for an escape, and your fingers were always clenching and unclenching. You could not settle." You were thin and unhealthy, and your hair was lank. You seemed like everything I had always heard about your father. And now? Sometimes I see glimpses of you in what I have heard of him, he acknowledged quietly. Your eyes will darken and go wide with glee, and sometimes you look triumphant when things go your way, and there is a look that appears on your face that makes me worry for you. But then you'll look at Daenerys or at Rhaego and it goes. You still do not trust me, Viserys mused, his eyes flashing away to Aerion and then back again. I know you have not been sleeping when I have taken watch. No, I do not, he replied. But you were a boy of 8 name days when you fled Westeros. You lost your father, cunt that he was, your brother, your niece, your nephew, your good sister and your mother within a year. You were a child. I think even a man fully grown would have struggled with that. I do not need you to make excuses for me. I am not, he snapped. Then he sighed loudly. Your sister is immeasurably kind. I know that. Everyone has always loved Dany. As do you, he replied, ignoring Viserys when he stiffened slightly. Dany is where we find common ground. Your sister is a dragon. But so are you. You've made terrible mistakes, unforgivable, but you also have suffered a harder life than many could fathom. I do not require your pity, bastard. I do not offer it. I offer my friendship. Friendship? Viserys asked, turning to look at him as he curled his mouth in a fashion that told Oren precisely what the man thought of Oren's offer. Friendship, he said again. I'll put a knife in your heart if you ever hurt your sister again. If you hurt anyone. But I'll also listen to you if you need someone to talk to. Why? He stared at Viserys, several years younger than him, and realized, for the first time since meeting him, that he was still a child in many ways. Even though Viserys had to grow up far quicker and with far more responsibility than he should have had to, he was so young. He had never had a friend nor a proper family. All he had was Dany, someone he was responsible for and had to protect. Viserys was weak and young. Perhaps not the same sort of weak of his father, but a browbeaten weakness that had just sucked the energy and life out of the man as he aged prematurely without ever really understanding anything. Why not? You can't change a man's nature, if that is what you are hoping to achieve, Viserys said quietly. I know that more than most. No. You cannot, he agreed. But I do not think your nature is as bad as you believe it to be. I sold my sister to be raped by a Dothraki for his army. I beat her. I hit her. I let him rape her. I told her 100 times I hated her. And you saved her life, he replied. One good deed does not wash out the bad, Viserys replied, quoting back the words that Oren had said to Daenerys on their journey to Westeros. He felt a flush creep up his face as he realized that Viserys must have heard him speak to Daenerys of his concerns about Viserys. He did not apologize, however. Instead, he simply said, it does not. But it is a start. 299 AC, Garland Tyrell. It had been a hard ride to the Riverlands. His first horse had thrown a shoe 2 times before. Eventually, he changed it out at the first farm he reached. Then, after that, he changed horses twice more, and each time he had asked the farmer to keep his silence and, in return, given him 2 extra gold dragons. He did not think they would speak, at least those outside the reach, but it was still worth trying to ensure they did not. He should have known when his first hose had thrown a shoe for the second time that something was trying to keep him from the Riverlands. Yet, he pressed on. Bitterbridge had been even worse. Lord Laurent Caswell had tried, repeatedly, to feast him. He had not even wished to stop at Bitterbridge, but he and Lord Laurent had nearly crashed into each other on the banks of the Mondea, and he had no choice but to take the offer of a good night's sleep in a feather bed. 4 days later, he was still there. Eventually he had managed to make his escape, but only when the letter came from father to summon the banners. He had been provisioned with a new horse, new leathers and more food than he reasonably needed and sent north, toward the Stony September. From there, rumors had increased that the Lannister army was on the move. He had dithered for several days in the town as he tried to decide what to do for the best. He had only decided to go south of the God's Eye at the last moment. Then, everything had slowed down considerably. He had dismounted his horse quickly, realizing that the added weight of him and his supplies was making it infinitely harder for the beast to make its way through the body marshland south of the God's Eye. So, together, he and his horse traipsed through the boggy marshlands where he repeatedly sunk knee-high into swamps, even when he was walking in the wooded areas, and spent most of his night shivering from the biting wind that seemed to whip up from the lake north of him. It was strange, he had reflected nearly every day since the God's Eye had come into sight, how a lake could be so beautiful on one hand and yet so terrifying on the other. He had watched, one day, safely hidden behind a thicket of trees as the sun glimmered of the waters of the lake and seemed so still, and then, seconds later, a few men had rowed past swearing and screaming as they lost control of their boat which, on the face of it, seemed to be under complete control. He pressed on. The days began to blur together as he slowly made his way around the God's Eye. He was sure that if he had kept going north, straight toward Riverrun, he would have arrived by now. But it would have been a foolish risk for, if the Lannister army was on the move, they would surely wish to take Riverrun and lay waste to as much of the riverlands on the western side of the God's Eye as they could. Given he could not be sure how long it would take them to find out the Reach had sided with the North, it was better he did not risk coming across them, no need to gift them a valuable hostage. That was his routine for nearly 2 weeks. It was well into the second moon, in truth approaching the third moon, of his journey before he realized, he was being followed. He wasn't sure how long whoever was behind him had been following him, but he knew someone was there. Just one person, judging by the sounds of snapping branches. He paused, glancing behind him, sure that he had heard a branch snap in the undergrowth much closer this time, but when he did not see anything he turned back and continued walking. He kept walking that entire day, not stopping to have a midday meal like he usually would, and instead of camping in the woods he moved closer to the shoreline of the lake when he made camp that night. He tied his horse to a tree stump near some tufty grass, took off his traveling cloak and then stood there waiting for his companion to appear. He wasn't too worried by whoever it was. Clearly, judging by the care they were taking, they were experienced but not a threat. If they wished him dead, they could have attacked him the day before at least, but they had not. Nonetheless, he felt his hand drift toward the pommel of his sword, and he grasped it carefully as he watched the bushes. It was smart not to go past Pink Maiden and head straight to Riverrun, a smooth voice said as the man finally stepped out of the trees. He hid a sigh, relaxed his stance and let go of his sword. Of all the men who could have been following him, Prince Oberyn was perhaps the only one he had not considered, but he could not say he minded. There was only one reason why the man would be here, and Garlan was not yet fighting for his life. "Prince Oberyn," he greeted. "I had not thought to see you so far north. Your grandmother sent me. She gave you proof, I assume." Prince Oberyn smiled sharply at him and stepped further toward the shoreline. Behind him his horse whinnied but settled down when he ran a hand down its neck. "May I?" He nodded and watched carefully as the man tied his own horse. There was a brief respite whilst Prince Oberyn then fussed over Garlan's own horse before, finally, he turned and crossed back over to Garlan. As he walked, he pulled a scroll from inside his cloak and then stopped a few feet away and extended his hand to hold it out, waiting patiently as Garlan took it carefully and then stepped away from him again. Then Prince Oberyn carefully untied a sword from around his waist and threw it into the dirt, along with 4 daggers he pulled from various places on his body, and took another 5 paces backwards. "For your comfort." He raised an eyebrow but nodded at the gesture anyway, unnecessary though it was. He turned his gaze back to the scroll in front of him and then unrolled it and skimmed it quickly. "Your Grace. The man before you has pledged his brother's support. I will send a scroll to my grandson when a hostage to his word arrives. Until then treat him with caution, but I do not think you need worry. Do make sure your brother keeps his head. I would hate for my granddaughter to become a widow so young. Lady Olenna Tyrell." "My grandmother always did have a way with words," he remarked blandly, rolling the scroll back up and gesturing for Prince Oberyn to gather his discarded weapons. "Tristan. Quentyn. What has grandmother told you?" he asked, setting himself back down on the sandy banks of the God's Eye and watching the other man. "No more than varies," did Prince Oberyn remarked, finally pausing in restrapping his weapons to his person to look at him. "Jon Snow is the bastard child of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. He means to claim the throne. Varys informed me whilst I was in King's Landing trying to ascertain why Ned Stark decided to resign as Hand of the King. He paused, considering the man carefully. You are hiding something. Your grandmother teach you that trick? Yes. Prince Oberyn barked out a laugh. I wonder, often, whether there is any of your father in Lady Olenna's grandchildren. Each one of you I meet is more like your grandmother than your father. He allowed the attempt to distract him, promising himself he would get the truth out of the other man eventually. I shall take it as a compliment. I passed a village not a week ago. Rumors have filtered in from the Crossroads Inn. A dragon has been spotted flying over the Vale. If you mean to head north, we should move quickly lest we miss this war completely. ****. They passed the time in the way that two men, who didn't really know each other or therefore even like each other, particularly given one of them had crippled the other's brother, were wont to do. They sparred and they argued. As the days drifted past, they argued less. In part because more and more rumors reached their ears of Pink Maiden being sacked, Acorn Hill being burned and then, one day from fleeing small folk who had taken one look at Oberyn and practically run towards them, of Gregor Clegane and his men taking Harrenhal. They had not moved for 2 days after that particular piece of news reached their ears, mostly because Garland had been reluctant to let Oberyn get any closer to Clegane than was absolutely necessary. Eventually though, once Oberyn had assured him that he did not intend to try and take revenge the second he saw Gregor Clegane, lest it be on the field of battle, and therefore was not going to put Garland's life at risk, they continued heading towards Harrenhal. It took another 2 weeks for them to see Harrenhal on the horizon. Then another few days to reach it, its size beguiling just how far away it was. How was Willers when you saw him last? Oberyn asked as they drew closer to Harrenhal. As he ever is. His leg. Paining him. The recommendation I sent on possible relief. Provided some comfort, but it pains him still. Particularly when it rains. I imagine he is enjoying the north then, Oberyn remarked dryly. Then fell silent as they crested the final hill before Harrenhal. It looks abandoned, he murmured as they pulled their horses up to a halt and surveyed the ruined fortress ahead of them. Pyres, Oberyn replied, guesting to their left. He glanced in the direction that Oberyn had gestured, slightly down the hill and to their left, and felt his face curl downwards in distaste. There were dozens of pyres spread out, the largest of which was still smoking. There was a battle here, he said. That's far too many pyres to just be small folk. Oberyn nodded once and then glanced around them, his gaze lingering on the ruined castle. We should see what is there. He nodded and together they dismounted their horses, unsheathed their swords, or in Oberyn's case pulled his spear off from where it had been strapped alongside his horse, and carefully began to walk toward the keep. It took an age to cross the field separating the woods to the south of the castle and the field where the pyres still smoked in the distance. Once they were close enough that they were sure archers could have hit them by now, they tied their horses to some roots and then proceeded together closer to the keep. They walked in silence, gripping their weapons and their eyes scanning around. It got harder to make shapes out the closer they got to the keep, for the sun was beginning to set behind it and the land was quickly becoming bathed in darkness that was so thick, in part because of the size of the keep, they could barely see through it. But they pressed on by unspoken agreement, neither of them willing to stop and risking not making it back to the woods and therefore, camp, before the sun set. They wouldn't sleep at Harrenhal. He stopped suddenly and heard Oberyn do likewise next to him. He didn't turn though and instead fixed his eyes on the charred remains of what had once been the great wooden gate that would have guarded the castle from enemies. It was as thick as nearly a full-grown man but aged with time and rotted through in places. Scorch marks licked up the wood, larger and darker than any flame he knew of could have made. He leaned forward and pressed the back of his non-sword hand cautiously against the wood, then pulled it sharply back with a muttered curse. It still burns hot, he murmured, glancing up at Oberyn who was stood staring at the door in abject horror. Dragonfire did this. You are sure? I have studied at the Citadel, there is no fire in the world that could have done this. Wildfire would burn too hot, there would not be a door left, and fire using an accelerant would burn out too fast. This is sustained, Oberyn replied, his mouth curling around the word sustained as though it were ugly. Would it have been enough to destroy the gate if it was not rotted with age? I do not know, Oberyn said eventually, his voice soft and eyes still fixed on the charred wood. But that it still burns hot now when even the pyres are naught but smoke, it worries me. 299 AC, Davos Seaworth. They met in a tent outside Storm's End. Renly was unwilling to even let Stannis in the castle, even though Stannis had made it clear that he would only be a threat to Renly if Renly acted first. Behind them, in the woods, thousands of Stannis men stood ready should the negotiations fail, not that it would do Davos and Stannis any good. However, Stannis seemed confident that Renly would not strike first. On the walls of Storm's End and in the valley, they had walked through between the woods and the keep, the men of Renly's army watched. All heavily armed and armored as though prepared to strike at a moment's notice. Although Davos hoped it would not be the case, he could not help but think, as they walked into the tent where Renly and Loras Tyrell stood waiting for them, right on the other side of the mustered men, which left him with an uncomfortable sensation in his gut, and saw the bleak faces of Lord Renly and Lord Loras, that war between the two brothers might well be inevitable. He had known there was no love between the two of them, and, even if Cresson had not warned him what to truly expect, it was written clear as day on both brothers' faces as they stared at each other. Renly and Stannis were as different as Davos and Loras Tyrell. Loras Tyrell and Renly both wore splendid armor and cloaks that were pristine in their cleanliness, nearly as clean as the two men wearing them, and were almost glowing, they were so clean. By comparison, Stannis and Davos both wore heavy traveling cloaks that, after riding hard for nearly a full day, were caked in mud and debris just like their wearers. Where Stannis wore no crown, not even before he bent the knee, Renly wore a ridiculous little circlet with golden antlers sticking out of it. The two brothers truly were as different as night and day. "I did not expect you to turn away from Robert's legacy so easily," Renly said, his voice goading as he stared at his brother. Next to him, Davos could hear Stannis grinding his teeth in annoyance. He knew Stannis had expected this. But he also knew that Renly frustrated Stannis when he acted like this, because they both knew it was not Renly that spoke, but the ghost of Robert, the man Renly wished to be. "Robert is dead." "I know. Dead at the hands of the Lannisters." There was a brief pause at that, as though both brothers had just fully come to terms with the death of Robert. Then, suddenly, Renly leaned forward and poured 4 measures of what looked to be ale into the 4 glasses on the table, and then, without waiting for anyone else, took a long swig of his. His face wrinkled as he drank, but he slammed the goblet back onto the table, nonetheless. Davos, Loras and Stannis all drank their own, and then silence settled over the room again. "He was our brother. Our throne," Renly said, sounding like a child and not a man who wished to be king. "You read my scroll." He hid a sigh and met the eyes of Loras Tyrell across the table. He knew, of course, about the rumors of a relationship between Loras and Renly, and standing across from them both he could well believe it. Not simply because of the way the two men were standing far closer than propriety dictated, but because Renly had angled himself slightly toward Loras, like a lover would when they were seeking comfort. "You bent the knee to the Mad King's grandchild. A boy with a dragon and 3 kingdoms, soon to be 4. Rumors," Renly spat. "No," Renly Stannis replied. "They are true. They are confirmed." Renly drew himself up to his full height. "What terms did he offer you? What terms could be so good that you would forsake our family and our duty?" "Do not speak to me of duty when you have no sense of it yourself," Stannis roared, his temper finally fraying. "Even if House Baratheon were to take the throne from the Lannisters, it cannot be you who sits the throne, Renly. Because I am younger. Because you are a fool." Stannis snapped. "You will sire no children. What sort of man longs to be king when he cannot and will not sire an heir?" Silence echoed over the tent. Opposite them, Renly had turned puce whilst Loras Tyrell had gone bright red, and his hand was gripping the pommel of his sword as though he meant to skewer through them the second he was given leave to. "Just because you wish to king does not mean you should be king," Stannis said a few moments later, his voice stiff. "You do not have the temperament, the time, the conviction nor the inclination to do your duty. You have never done your duty. And you have. With your ugly little daughter. You have no sons either, brother. She is my heir. So, because you have an heir, I should relinquish my claim to you. You have no claim. I am Robert's heir. You are not." Stannis sighed, all fight leaving him. "Robert's heir would be his oldest living brother, me. And as you do not wish for the crown and have bent the knee, that defaults the crown to me. You won't win, Renly, and if you persist in this you will not only lose but you will die. Just because no one wants you for their king, does not mean I am without friends, brother," Renly said finally, his voice soft. "But you are," Stannis replied, his own voice softening. The Targaryen loyalists and half the Stormlands stand behind Jon Snow. The Reach stands behind Jon Snow. The North stands behind Jon Snow. The Riverlands stand behind Jon Snow. Within the Moon I expect he will have offers from Dorne and the Vale. In this endeavor you are without friends and allies. I do not know how many times I must say this, but I will say it one more time, if you persist you will die. Armies can be defeated. But not yours. I know you. You were counting on the support of the Reach, but it is not coming. Just because you are a coward who would sooner bend the knee to the Mad King's grandson than fight does not make me one. It makes you a fool, Stannis snarled. Then, realizing he was not about to convince his brother to change his mind, he turned away from the table muttering, "Sir Davos, come. We return to Dragonstone." Instinctively he was moving to follow Stannis, but then he glanced behind him and met the pensive stare of Loras Tyrell, who was chewing his lip nervously and looking torn between terror and fury. "Forgive me, Lord," he said quietly, turning back to look at Stannis. Then he spun fully to look at Renly, still staring angrily at his brother, and Loras Tyrell, whose eyes had now fixed on him. "Lord Stannis came here in good faith, Lord Renly," he began carefully, his voice growing in confidence the longer he spoke. "This is not a game where the loser can hold his head high and live to see another dawn. This is war. You have not seen a true war, Lord Renly. Lord Stannis and I have. We have watched as men we knew and respected turned against their friends and their family for a bit of power, and they burned for it. Jon Snow may be Ned Stark's son, but the lords of Westeros will have expectations of him when he sits on the throne, and they will expect vengeance against those who fought against them and justice for those that died fighting. House Tyrell is not coming to your aid. Lord Stannis speaks true. They have marched for Jon Snow. If they were coming to support your claim, then they would be here by now, and I am sure Lord Loras knows that, and he has told you that. Your loyalty to my brother has blinded you, Sir Davos. As Lord Loras' loyalty has blinded you both," he snapped. "Lord Stannis did not come here to speak to you because he was asked. Jon Snow did not ask nor demand that Lord Stannis to come to you, to persuade you to his side nor to force you to bend the knee. Lord Stannis came here because you are, first and foremost, his blood. His first thought when he heard of Jon Snow was of Lady Shireen and of you. Can you say the same?" "You speak out of turn, Sir Davos," Renly said quietly, his blue eyes as dark as Stannis had been when he had cast Melisandre out of his council. His face was such that, in that moment, he looked so like Lord Stannis that Davos could not help but think that had they been closer in age than as children they could have easily been mistaken for each other. It was the first time since they had walked into the tent that he truly could see that the two men were blood. "But you say what my brother would not and what I would hear." He felt his mouth open slightly but immediately closed it. Next to him, he heard Stannis turn, his cloak brushed past Davos, and then Stannis was stood next to him again, watching his brother carefully. "Renly." He spared a passing look at Loras Tyrell, who had a smidgen of hope on his dull face, as though he prayed, like Davos, that Renly was about to change his mind. As he watched, Loras Tyrell and Renly shared a long look before, eventually, Loras Tyrell sighed out a deep breath and closed his eyes momentarily as he relaxed completely. "Well, brother," Renly said, finally wrenching away from Loras Tyrell to fix Stannis with a brittle smile, "it looks like I must muster my men to march north with you." ****. He knew, from everything Cresson had told him, that Stannis and Renly had been close once. Perhaps not as close as two brothers should have been, and certainly not as close as Davos hoped his own sons would be one day, but there had been love there. Yet, he also knew that over the years that love had vanished. They were but strangers now, and it showed in everything they did in the coming days and weeks. In the evenings, as the army began its march, nearly 2 weeks later than they had hoped, Stannis and Renly took their meals separately. In fact, to Davos' gaze, they barely spoke, other than to argue. And they argued about everything, from how many rations the men should have for their food, to which direction they should march, to who should ride at the front, to which lords should be at their war councils. Other than arguing with his brother, Renly spent all his time in the company of those who had originally been in his Kingsguard. Stannis, by contrast, spent all his time with the lords who had flocked to his and Renly's cause. Perhaps, although Davos would certainly never say such things to Stannis, because he had taken Renly's words to him to heart, or perhaps because he wished to be sure of their loyalty. Either way, it left Davos mostly in a position where he could watch the two brothers and, as the days went on, he only grew more confused. "Brothers are complicated," a voice said next to him. He flinched and inadvertently kicked his horse, so it spooked slightly. It took a few moments to wrangle it back under control and, once he did so, he was pleased that Loras Tyrell did not comment on his poor riding skills. Together they dismounted and headed into the camp, where Stannis and Renly were. "I would not know," he replied eventually, his eyes fixed on Stannis and Renly as they argued, as usual, across the table between them and gestured furiously at the map. "I have two," Loras continued, as though Davos had not spoken. His voice was soft, as though he hoped not to be overheard, although, in truth, there was not much danger of that given how loudly Stannis and Renly were yelling at each other. "Some days I hate them as much as I love them. They are older. Yes. Garlan is the greatest swordsman that lives in Westeros, and Willers is the most educated heir in the Seven Kingdoms. I have seen you with a sword. I find it hard to believe any can best you." "Two can," Loras replied after a lengthy pause. "Lady Brienne of Tarth and Garlan. Perhaps the Kingslayer could if he ever left his sister's bed." He paused for a moment and turned slightly to look at Sir Davos. The action took his eyes off Renly for the first time since they had entered the tent hours before, but Davos did not turn to meet his gaze, too intent on keeping his eye on Stannis, who was growing redder as more time went by. "Brothers are complicated. They can be as different as night and day and yet so similar at the same time," Loras said again. "It would have killed Renly to be on opposite sides of this war to Lord Stannis. But he would have done it, because he thought it was his duty. His right. I know what the lords say of him, that he is flowery and soft and vapid and cares little for anyone but himself. But he is a Baratheon. He does know his duty, under everything. Maester Cresson always spoke highly of him," he said finally. "And Renly of him," Loras murmured. "Renly told me stories once of how, during the siege during the rebellion, Cresson would give Renly half of his food. He thinks that Stannis knew, for given the size of their rations, Cresson should have starved based on how little food there was." He paused, unsure of what to say. "Lord Stannis would never admit to that. Neither would Renly." There was another brief pause. "Renly is as prickly and as proud as Lord Stannis, he just hides it better, and when it does show, it is in a different way. Won't listen. You never listen." Renly barked out, turning away from Stannis and interrupting the reply that Davos was about to give Loras. "I owe you my thanks, Sir Davos," Loras continued quietly, speaking before Davos could and watching as Renly drew closer. "But make no mistake, should your king turn on mine, I will cut you open in your sleep and think naught of it." Chapter 26, Choice. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary. Our travelers meet on the field of battle. Notes: Jon's POV of the battle, and the lead up to it, will be in the next chapter. Enjoy. 299 AC, Oren Waters. "Who goes there?" "Oren Waters," he called, holding up his hands and taking another step into the light. "Brother to Montford Valerian, Lord of the Tides and Master of Driftmark. I wish to speak to Lord Yohn Royce." The two men who had drawn their swords looked at him and then passed him into the darkness. One took a step toward him. "Who else is with you?" "We know there is another. A friend and ally," he called back. "He will come out when I have spoken to Lord Royce." The first soldier squinted into the darkness and then glanced at his companion. "Go and find Lord Royce and Lord Grafton. I shall remain here." The second soldier nodded once, sheathed his sword and then turned and strode back into the encampment. Oren didn't look at the soldier who had remained, who he knew was watching him, but instead took the opportunity to look between the gaps in the tents towards the encampment, trying to guess how many men the two lords had mustered. He did not have a chance to really see much further than the fires burning in braziers before several men were striding toward him in the early twilight, their hands all on the pommels of their swords. He cast his eyes over them, instantly recognizing Lord Royce, Lord Grafton and several other men he had seen during his frequent trips to Gulltown and Runestone over the years. Lord Oren Yohn Royce greeted, his eyes widening in surprise as he stepped out from between the tents and closer to Oren. "I did not think to see you here." He took a step forward, moving past the soldier who he had been left with, and closer toward the lords in front of him. "It is good to see you again, Lord Royce," he replied carefully. "My thanks for not attacking us as we slept and instead waiting for us to approach." "Think nothing of it," Yohn Royce boomed back. "I feared more for the two men marching through these mountains alone than I did for my own forces. Did the mountain clans trouble you?" "At first, but we were able to convince them to leave us be." Yohn Royce's bushy white eyebrows rose slightly. "And who is this we you speak of, Lord Oren?" Later he said shortly. "You do not trust me. I want to be certain the rumors in Gulltown were true." "Which ones?" "The ones that said you and Lord Grafton had summoned your banners for the Targaryen king," he said, leaning backward to place his way on one foot, ready to turn and run should he need to. "They said Lysa Arryn, mad bint that she is, has declared you both to be traitors." Lord Royce and Lord Grafton shared a long look, and then Yohn Royce sighed. "We have." "She has?" He nodded. "Where do you ride to?" "Riverrun." "Why did you bend the knee?" "We saw the dragon over Gulltown," Lord Grafton replied, his voice tight. "I watched as it circled above my keep and above the small folk, and then it left. It left and did not return. I sent word to Lord Yohn the next day, if the dragons have returned, then House Targaryen has returned with them." "We had already received the ravens from Stannis Baratheon and Ned Stark claiming that Joffrey is but a bastard born of incest. The only difference in their scrolls was that Stannis declared for himself, and Ned for his son." "And you thought the son of Ned Stark, even if he was a Targaryen, would be a better candidate for the Iron Throne?" "I." They fell into silence for a few moments. Oren watched the two lords closely. He knew Yohn Royce better than Drold Grafton, for Yohn Royce had spent nearly as much time in and around King's Landing over the last few years as Oren had. "If you kill us, or turn on us, the king will know," he said eventually. Yohn Royce's bushy eyebrows rose further. "I can have my men bring bread, salt and mead if that will ease your fears." "It would." "And your companion?" "Once I have partaken of guest rite, you may come with me to offer the same hospitality to him." "You trust me so little, Lord Waters." "It is not personal." It took less time for Oren to partake of guest rite than he had expected and, within what felt like a few minutes, he and Lord Royce, who was now unarmed and unarmored, turned their backs on the encampment behind them and crossed through the fields and into the woods at the base of the mountains. They walked in silence for a few moments until, eventually, they pushed their way through a thicket of brambles, and both stumbled into the clearing. Viserys had his back to them and was crouched down, but he rose and turned after a second or so. There was a brief pause and then Viserys smiled at him, not the true smile he gave Rhaegon or Daenerys, but one that was less forced than it had been but a few moons ago. It didn't quite meet his eyes and there was a tightness to it that told Oren that Viserys was uncomfortable, but it was there nonetheless. Lord Royce Viserys greeted, striding forwards and wiping his hands down on his cloak as he did so. "A pleasure to meet you at last. My apologies for the deception." An uncomfortable silence descended over the trio as Yohn Royce stared at Viserys, his mouth open and his hands flexing around the salted bread and mead he had brought with him. He watched both men in amusement, Viserys appearing to be more baffled as the moments slipped past and Yohn Royce growing redder and redder. "Well," Yohn Royce said at last, his voice both bewildered and delighted, "this is a surprise. You understand why I did not wish to enter your encampment until I was sure?" "I do," Yohn Royce agreed, not turning away from Viserys. Then, abruptly he bowed deeply and said, "Prince Viserys, it is an honor to meet you. House Royce has pledged to fight with House Targaryen in the wars to come and I will be honored to fight alongside you." Oren's eyes remained fixed on Viserys as Yohn Royce spoke. He noticed Viserys' shoulders tense slightly, almost imperceptibly, as he was referred to as Prince and then as Viserys' eyes moved from Yohn Royce's face to his hands and then back again. It was hardly noticeably but to Oren, who had spent weeks with just Viserys for company, he could easily recognize the way that Yohn Royce's words seemed to settle whatever feeling of caution and frustration Viserys had been feeling. He let himself sink into his own mind as Yohn Royce and Viserys spoke and as Viserys took the offered salted bread and mead and then the two headed over to the two horses to untether their reins from the tree and take them back to camp. He walked behind the two men as they exited the woods and then as they began to enter the light from the encampment. He only pulled himself out of his thoughts when a loud screech echoed overhead followed by a flash of bright, brilliant, fire as Arion swooped down from above the early evening clouds and soared above them. Screams and shouts came from the encampment. "Stand down!" Youn Roi boomed loudly. "Stand down!" The soldiers kept panicking. "Stand down!" Viserys roared, his voice, still with that undercurrent of Essos about it, cutting through the screams of the men around them. Abruptly, hundreds of pairs of eyes turned away from the dragon that was swooping over the encampment towards where Viserys and Oberyn stood. "Well, fuck me," drawled Grafton said, lowering his sword and then sheathing it. 299 AC, Oberyn Martell. He had never taken the time to get to know more about Wylla's brothers and sisters when he corresponded with his friend. He had assumed Margaery to be nothing more than a puppet of her grandmother, Garland to be little more than a brute, and the less said about the little flower, Loras, the better. He had been wrong, at least about Garland Tyrell. In the days that followed his arrival at Garland Tyrell's camp, not truly a camp given it was one man, his horse and a small boulder, he realized he had been remiss all these years in not seeking to learn more about the Tyrell children. Garland Tyrell was, without a doubt, as sharp as his grandmother, as kind as his brother and as good with a sword as Oberyn was with a spear. He was also not without appeal, broad, muscular and with the typical Tyrell eyes that sparkled with mischief. It made Oberyn wonder what his other siblings might be like. It made for an interesting journey. What made for a more interesting journey was watching the man get more tense the closer they approached the Northern Army. If Oberyn had not been convinced that House Tyrell were hiding something before then, he certainly was by the time they left Harrenhal. It took another 2 weeks after their departure from Harrenhal to close the gap between them and the northern forces who, based on the rumors of the small folk, had since departed Harroway's town and now marched west toward Riverrun where they were likely to encounter the Lannister army. It was only on the 15th day since they left Harrenhal that he saw the army, who had made camp for the evening, in the distance. "It is larger than the reports suggested," Garland said, his voice breaking through Oberyn's inspection of the very tidy camp. "Yes," he agreed. "And either this boy knows war, or he has good advisors who he listens to." "I see no dragon though," Garland continued, his voice quieter now as though worried they were likely to be overhead. "Do you think we were wrong?" He shook his head but did not speak for a moment, his eyes scanning the sky around them. "It is still an animal. It needs to hunt and feed. Come, we should ride on. If we dally here they may think we are spies." Then he kicked his horse into a slot trot and urged it along the river road toward the Northern Army. "What will you do?" "Speak to him," he replied. "Why? Do you think I will split him in two? That I will slip poison into his food? That I will push him into the Red Fork and hold his head under? I do not know what to think, Oberyn." "You read the letter." "My grandmother is not here," Garland replied. "And my grandmother does not know what men are capable of doing for their sister." Above their head, a shadow swallowed the sunlight, and he chanced to glance up, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the dragon. His eyes traced across its body as it swooped over them and then took off above the encampment, loosing a loud roar that brought men out of their tents to glance first at the dragon and then at them. It was large. Larger than several of the dragon skulls he had seen in the Red Keep during the Targaryen reign. He smiled. Then he said quietly, "Your sister is alive, unless I am mistaken." In front of them, men hurried around the encampment and he could see guards at the edge calling back to alert those inside the camp of the arrival of Garland and Oberyn. He slowed his horse slightly, leaning back in the saddle and murmuring gently to the beast that had spooked slightly, but not taken off, when it had seen the dragon. Next to him, Garland did likewise. "And if she were dead, I would do far worse than you." They were at the edge of the encampment, watching as a man of similar height to Oberyn, not tall and not short, with dark brown hair and grey eyes, with a plain black cloak thrown over his shoulder, strode towards him with half a dozen other men around him before Oberyn spoke again. "No, Garland. You would not." Garland did not reply and instead dismounted from his horse, grasped its reins in one hand and then swooped into a deep bow. Oberyn sighed and dismounted as well but did not bow. His eyes remained fixed on the man striding toward him, a great big white direwolf, that Oberyn had not noticed at first, by his side. It had been a long time, over 5 and 10 years, since he had seen a Stark. Yet, looking at Jon Snow, it was easy to see how the boy had been so successfully hidden in the north. He was exactly as Oberyn remembered Ned Stark looking all those years before, perhaps a touch shorter and slimmer, but the color of the eyes and hair were the same and the mannerisms were likewise similar. But there was a look to Jon Snow that Ned Stark had never had, a sharpness to his eyes that made him think, for a very brief moment, of Rollo even though the color was so different. Jon Snow stopped but a few paces away and glanced between Oberyn and Garland with a surprised look but did not speak. "Your Grace," Garland said, speaking as he rose from his bow. "I bring word from Highgarden." "My name is Garland Tyrell," Jon Snow interrupted, a smile on his face. "I would recognize a Tyrell anywhere. Your sister and brother look much like you." The boy turned away from Garland to look at Oberyn. "And you are Prince Oberyn Martell? I had not thought you see you here." "I was intrigued." Jon Snow did nothing but raise an eyebrow. A small smile flickered over his lips but was gone in an instant and then jerked his head slightly in an acknowledgement. "I have a scroll for you, Your Grace," Garland Tyrell murmured, breaking the slightly uncomfortable silence that had settled over the group. Oberyn barely spared him a glance and instead looked over the rest of the group that Jon Snow had brought with him. Ned Stark was easily recognizable, his hand on the pommel of his sword and his eyes fixed on Oberyn with an expression that told Oberyn that should he even consider making a move against Jon that he would be dead before he could so much as twitch. On his other side was a boy who looked so much like a Tully that he could only be Robb Stark, Garland's new good brother. He, likewise, had a hand on the pommel of his sword. There was a way to which he held himself that made Oberyn think that a spar with Robb Stark might be quite enjoyable. The rest of the group he glanced over in only a few seconds and then went back to looking at Jon Snow, who was now staring at the scroll in his hands as though it was the greatest gift he could ever have received. "Lord Garland, my father will take you to a tent to wash and we shall find new clothes for you," Jon Snow said eventually, not taking his eyes off Oberyn. "Prince Oberyn, my brother shall likewise see to you. Once you are ready, I would be pleased to meet to discuss terms." Then Jon Snow jerked his head at one of the other men nearby and headed off in the direction of the encampment again. He stared after him for a moment, having expected more of a reception. "We just received word from scouts. The Lannister army is less than half of what we expected. Jon is trying to decide what we should do," Robb Stark said, taking a step toward Oberyn and then turning slightly and jerking his head toward the encampment. "A trap?" he asked, tugging his horse's reins and beginning to walk in the direction of the camp. "We do not know. Tywin Lannister cannot hope to split his forces and take on the might of the Reach alone. He will double back," he replied. "He will wish you to believe that he has taken half his men toward the Reach and from there to King's Landing, but he will not do so." "Why not?" "He is a Lannister." "You think we will face the full might of the Lannister forces?" He nodded, his eyes moving across the encampment. Dark and grim eyes met him, every man and woman he passed meeting his gaze head-on and not turning away. "Why?" "Because if he crushes you now, then the rest will fall in line." Robb Stark hummed thoughtfully. "You should speak to Jon of it, he will wish to hear your opinion. You speak of the boy you crowned king with great familiarity." "He is my brother," Robb Stark replied immediately, his voice biting and sharp but tinged with an undercurrent that made Oberyn think that, perhaps, he had slightly offended the boy. "He is your cousin." The boy stopped walking immediately and Oberyn found himself half a pace ahead of him. He turned back around slightly to watch Robb Stark closely. The boy was staring at him with those beautiful blue eyes, but unlike earlier, where they had sparkled with joy and intrigue, they were now creased in annoyance and darker. "It may be different in Dawn," Robb Stark said carefully, his voice flat as though it took him a great effort to not shout, "but Jon was raised as my brother. He will always be my brother, no matter who his mother is." Then the man brushed past him and continued on toward the tent that he had been leading Oberyn to. He watched him go for a moment and then took several long strides to catch up with Robb Stark. They did not speak again until Robb had pushed back the flap of the tent and told him that someone would come along shortly and provide him with any comforts he might need, including food and a bowl to wash himself in, and once he was ready one of the Northmen would escort him to Jon's tent so they could talk. Robb Stark was several paces away when Oberyn finally spoke again. "It is not different in Dawn. 299 AC, Jon Snow. What will you do about Prince Oberyn?" He glanced toward the entrance of his tent and gestured for Robb to join him at the makeshift table he had set up. In truth, it was a fallen log about 4 feet thick that he and some men had dragged into his tent when they set up camp, and sighed. Together they surveyed the maps in silence for a few moments. "There is nothing I can do," he replied eventually, turning his attention from the map to look at Robb. "Lady Olenna has vouched for him. You trust he will not seek to stab you in the back?" "As much as I trust any man who is not family," he murmured. "Oberyn Martell has more reasons to wish me dead than any man in Westeros, and he has more reason to want me alive than any man as well." "What did Lady Olenna say?" "That she will shortly have a hostage to his good behavior and not to trust him until then." "It appears you will owe Lady Olenna a great deal once this war is done," Brother Robb remarked, glancing up from where he had been looking at the map with Jon to meet his eyes. "She has given you the Dornish and the Reach. I suppose I should consider myself lucky that Lady Margaery has wed you, lest I would find myself with a bride before I was ready," he jested, unable to stop himself smiling when Robb's face went momentarily blank as he thought about Lady Margaery. Then he sighed and glanced back at the map. "We will be at Riverrun within the week." "You are worried as we have not yet encountered any other Riverlands forces?" He agreed. "Lady Catelyn and I sent word to the keeps that we missed on our journey south, Seaguard, Raventree Hall, amongst others. If we arrive at Riverrun before they do, we shall not have the forces to take it if the Lannister army has mustered there." "You do not think Tywin has split his men?" "I don't know," he groused out, frustration leaching into his voice. "I could take Winter to scout and see. But then if Tywin has not split his men, you would leave us exposed and they will scouts watching our progress. The moment they see you leave they will likely abandon Riverrun and attack us," Robb finished grimly. "You should speak to Prince Oberyn of this. He does not think you can trust that Lord Tywin has split his forces." "We are in agreement on that," he replied. "He will know by now of Winter and he will know our numbers. Whatever awaits us at Riverrun, I do not think it will be so easy as Harrenhal. A smart man would feint and then attack us with his full might." "We could wait for the Reach or the Knights of the Vale," Robb murmured, glancing up at him. "Surely Lord Mace and his men can only be but a few weeks away, and likewise Lord Royce." "I am wary of waiting," he replied quietly. "The longer we wait the weaker we look, and it gives more time for Lord Tywin to sway more banners to his cause. Besides, they could attack us on the road, and we would be unprepared. The element of surprise would be better for all of us." "You think we will be betrayed?" "Yes. The Northern Lords are loyal, Robb," he agreed. "But loyalty can be bought, and it can be lost. All it would take is the right offer, being match, gold, a match, mayhaps the elevation of a house, and we would find ourselves with no allies. Particularly facing the odds, we might well be. Northerners are different, Jon." He did not reply and stared at the map instead, trying to decide whether it was worth arguing with his brother about what men would do for power. "Ghost will stay with Lady Catelyn," he said finally, raising his eyes from the map to glance at Robb. "He'll protect her." Robb nodded, his face tense. He made to open his mouth, likely to suggest that Grey Wind did likewise, but was unable to speak before someone else interrupted them. "Your Grace." "Yes?" he asked, turning to look towards the entrance of his tent. "Prince Oberyn wishes to speak with you," Daisy Mormont said, sticking her head through the tent flap. "Very well," he replied. "Will you tell father of what we have discussed?" When Robb nodded, he smiled at his brother and then turned and left the tent. Prince Oberyn, now freshly shaven and looking cleaner than he had a few hours prior when he had arrived at the encampment, greeted him with a small tilt of the head and then gestured toward the edge of the encampment where Winter was huddled down near the remains of a deer. "You wish to meet her, Prince Oberyn?" he asked, falling into step beside the man as they walked toward his dragon. "What happened with Kevan Lannister?" "He killed 2 heirs to northern houses after he and his men surrendered." "Who killed him?" "I did." "Dragonfire? Sword?" "Rhaegar would never have done that," Prince Oberyn replied eventually, once they had left the safety of the encampment and were far enough away that no one could hear them. "I am not Rhaegar." "No, you are not," Prince Oberyn said a few moments later. "Your men talk of how your dragon bathed men in her fire and left them to burn on the field of battle. They talk of how you cleaved Lannister men clean in two and your direwolf tore them to shreds and you ignored them as they died and instead kept fighting. Beautiful, noble, Rhaegar Targaryen would not have done that." "Ned Stark is my father," he said quietly. "Yet, Ned Stark would not have done that either." He would not kill a man he could hostage, and he would balk at the idea of burning men with dragon fire. Prince Oberyn replied. You are neither Ned Stark nor Rhaegar Targaryen. There was a long pause, and then Prince Oberyn turned to look at him, angling himself away from Winter and leaning forward slightly onto the balls of his feet until he was almost breathing the air that Jon had puffed out. I would like Lord Tywine. He glanced away from the man and toward Winter, who was watching them carefully, her claws digging into the ground, but not as though she was ready to attack, but more as though she wished to lean forward and insert herself between them. I cannot condone torture. You do not have to condone it, Prince Oberyn replied. Nor must you be party to it. Nonetheless. What if it was your sister? The words were barely above a whisper, and Prince Oberyn was no longer looking at him, but he heard him as clearly as though the man had screamed them in his ear. I'd kill them all. Then why do you forbid me? You wish for Dornish support, this is our price. Your support is not here now, not when I need it most. Some would argue I do not need it. You do, for when this war is won, Prince Oberyn said sharply. For as long as there has been an Iron Throne, the Dornish have been outside it. Oh, we are part of your 7 kingdoms, but we are also not. We were a part of it through marriage. We never bowed to House Targaryen. You wish for a secure rule. For the lords of Westeros to not try and convince me, to convince my brother, to turn traitor on you. I have told you my price. It is your choice. So that is your request. A marriage or Lord Tywine? Yes. I cannot marry your niece, you know that. I do. I cannot let you kill Lord Tywine. You can. It was his turn to bark out a laugh then. What of the mountain? What of Amory Lorque? I will have them all. You ask for much, Prince Oberyn. I ask for nothing that you cannot give. He did not reply and instead sighed deeply, leaned back on one leg and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Prince Oberyn had not moved but was now staring at Winter with a pensive expression on his face. May I touch her? Best you ask her permission, my prince, he murmured. She will let you if she wishes. And if she does not wish? Her flames are strong. It will be quick. That made the man bark out a laugh. Then Prince Oberyn was walking slowly toward Winter, who watched him carefully. The man paused a few feet away from her and held his hand out carefully, his eyes fixed on her. There was a long pause before interest and amusement seemed to flood through the bond he shared with Winter. Then she extended her neck and shoved the tip of her nose hard against Prince Oberyn's hand, making him stagger back a pace or so. He righted himself quickly and barked out another harsh laugh and ran his hand across her face. She is magnificent, Prince Oberyn murmured, his voice carrying over to where Jon stood. To think such creatures can exist again. As Jon watched, the man's hand moved away from Winter's snout and trailed down her neck slightly. Then, abruptly, Prince Oberyn was looking at him again. She is sentient. Of course. I mean, she understands, Prince Oberyn said, turning back to look at Winter. She has thoughts and opinions. She does. Does she show it in her deeds or her thoughts? He paused, considering the man's back carefully. In both. I can feel what she feels, if she feels it strongly enough. What does she feel now? Amusement, he replied. And interest. You intrigue her. Prince Oberyn hummed thoughtfully, but his eyes remained fixed on the dragon. She does not consider me a threat. No. They descended into silence. Prince Oberyn remained fixated on Winter, his hand running down her neck as she loomed over him, and Jon remained fixated on the pair of them. Many of his allies had met Winter, but none, save Willers Tyrell, who he was sure would be intrigued by any animal he met, had truly come close to showing this level of awe and intrigue in Winter. He could feel her satisfaction trickling and glee through their bond, and, for a moment, the loneliness that seemed to always be present in the back of his mind lifted slightly. I do not think I shall ever like you nor call your family. That you lived when they did not, I should not blame you for it, but I do, Prince Oberyn said eventually, breaking the silence between them, as he turned away from Winter and headed back toward Jon. His eyes were wet, but the look that Prince Oberyn gave him was nothing but determination and strength, not an inch of weakness or fragility to be seen in them. Prince Oberyn stopped next to him, and there was a brief pause before the man lifted the arm closest to Jon and put a hand on his shoulder. I half hoped I would see them in you. But I do not. It is better this way, I think. The man paused and took a deep breath. I will fight by your side in this war, and when the fighting is done, and you have given me Tywin Lannister, Dorne will bend the knee. He did not speak for a few moments and instead turned to look at Winter, who was watching him carefully. Determination and grief seemed to pour through their bond for a moment, and then it vanished, as though she did not wish to feel what she felt. He sighed and, feeling like he was making the biggest mistake of his life, murmured, "You will have him, Prince Oberyn," he replied, reaching out to place his own hand on the man's shoulder. "For Elia, Rhaenys and Aegon, you will have him. I give you my word." 299 AC, Viserys Targaryen. The smoking ruins of Stonehenge, set slightly off the river road, were just discernible over the tops of the trees that surrounded it. Next to him, Yohn Royce and Lord Gerald Grafton were talking quietly but abruptly stopped as the wind blew smoke onto the river road. Behind him he heard someone cough and mutterings amongst the men. "How far are we from Riverrun?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the burned-out keep in the distance. 3 days at this pace, Prince Viserys Yohn Royce replied. His mouth flattened inadvertently, and he felt his shoulders tense. Above him, Aerion let out an angry shriek. He glanced up and watched as his dragon flew off toward Stonehenge, his wings beating steadily. He turned his attention away from the keep then and toward the road in front of them. "Tell me more of Riverrun. What are its defenses?" "Riverrun is practically impregnable. When the moat is flooded, all 3 sides of the castle are surrounded by water, and unless the drawbridge is lowered there is no getting in nor out." "Have you seen the moat flooded?" "During the rebellion. When Lady Catelyn was with child, Lord Tully ordered that the moat be flooded until the war was won." He nodded to himself. "So, the moat will be flooded now. Why would the Lannister army lay siege to a keep they cannot?" He trailed off then sighed. "Because of the North. Robb Stark is the grandchild of lost Tully, he will want to lift the siege." Stark on Oren muttered darkly. He was spared answering as a horse shot out of the woods to the south of them, announcing the arrival of one of their scouts. The man spared the rest of the army barely a passing glance and rode at full tilt to Viserys. "Prince Viserys," he gasped. "Lannister forces massed at Riverrun. The king's forces number far fewer and are but a day's ride away." "Shit," someone muttered. He ignored whoever had spoken and tried, desperately, to hide his flinch at the word prince. "How many Lannisters?" 70,000 Lannister men, the scout reported. "Less than 15,000 North and Riverlands men by my best guess." "They must have decided not to try and march on King's Landing," Lord Royce muttered. "A gamble, a risky one that may pay off." "That's the full might of the Lannister forces at Riverrun." "What do you mean, Lord Royce?" Gunthor Grafton asked, appearing from the army behind Viserys and stopping close to his father's horse. "Lord Royce means that the Lannisters have decided that, if they kill Jon Snow and squash the northern forces at Riverrun, that they will have killed the main claimant to the throne," he replied, speaking before Lord Royce could. "They have assumed, likely rightly, that destroying Jon Snow's host will make the rest of the kingdoms who have raised their banners for him stand down and bend the knee. Or at least divide their loyalty amongst other claimants. You think they do not know about the Reach?" He shook his head. "They cannot do. If they had, then surely Tywin would not risk it all at Riverrun." "Lord Mace must have moved as slowly as he did in the rebellion," someone muttered darkly behind them. "Traitorous cunt." "It matters not," he said sharply, desperately pushing down at the frustration he felt inside him. "If Jon Snow is killed at Riverrun, then the northern forces are lost as are the Riverlands. Dorne will likely sit this war out, and the forces Stannis has raised, even if he has managed to persuade his brother to side with Jon Snow, will not reach us in time. Nor will the Reach. It would be us against the remainder of the Lannister forces, which, if we are lucky, would be at half numbers, but given the odds against the northern forces I would not count on it." "We have no choice," Yohn Royce agreed. "We have no choice," he echoed. "How far out are the northern forces?" "A day ahead of us," the scout replied quickly. "But they move fast. They killed a Lannister scout but a few days ago. They will be there by the morrow. They are hoping to catch them unawares," he muttered. "How far out are we from Riverrun?" 3 days. Much less if we half kill our horses." He felt his mouth set in a grim line. Behind him, whispers broke out amongst the soldiers and minor lords. He knew what he should do, but, despite that, it still took a few moments for him to decide whether it was the path he wished to take. He chanced a quick glance at Oren, who was looking at him expectantly, and then inclined his head. "We ride hard," he called, kicking his horse and pulling on its reins to turn it around to face the army behind him. "We ride through the night." ****. They could hear the battle roaring in front of them before they could see it, and long before they could smell the blood and death that permeated the air. The noise of war did not bother him. Perhaps it was his time spent with the Dothraki, although in truth he had never found the sound war to be unpleasant, but the smell that wafted in on the wind made him feel sick. His stomach clenched and he wanted nothing more than to turn his head sideways and throw up the last of the food he had eaten that night as they rode. Instead, he kicked his horse faster and bent down against the saddle to unsheath his sword. His horse whinnied pitifully and stumbled slightly but kept going. Above him, Aryan let out a shrill roar. There was a brief pause and then a louder, deeper and more furious roar answered it. Suddenly the men behind Viserys, and then Viserys himself, were plunged into darkness as a dragon swooped overhead only a few dozen feet above the army. Aryan let out another shrill shriek. He glanced up, taking his eyes off the ground in front of him for a moment, to look at Jon Snow's dragon. It swooped above him, its wings beating once for every half-dozen flaps of Aryans, and he felt his mouth open slightly as he caught sight of a figure on the dragon's back pressed low against it. "For the king!" Lord Royce roared. He flinched slightly, unable to help himself. On his other side, he felt Oren's eyes on him and cast a quick sideways glance toward the man. When their eyes through the gaps in their respective helms met, he saw concern and sympathy there and quickly turned away again. "For the king!" he roared, rising in the saddle, lifting his sword above his head and kicking his horse harder. "For House Targaryen!" As they closed the distance between the two fighting armies, the smell and sounds grew stronger, and he felt bile rise in his throat but swallowed it back down. Behind the fighting armies he watched as men lined up. Behind him, someone roared, "Shields!" He kicked his horse faster, knowing he did not have the strength necessary to raise a shield above his head as he rode, even if he had one. "For the king!" The Lannister archers, who remained separate from the battle to the south of the river road, released their arrows then. Half of them were lost to dragon flame but the remainder flew towards Viserys and the Knights of the Vale. He ducked, crouching himself low against his horse and kicking it harder as the sound of arrows hitting their targets behind him made themselves known. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Jon Snow's dragon swooping around the edge of the battlefield. It let out bursts of fire, but it could not do more. The men were fighting together, and should it try and release its flames on the Lannister soldiers it would be just as likely, if not more so, to kill Jon Snow's own men. Aryan followed it, his wings flapping furiously as he tried to keep pace. More arrows flew over the top of him, and he ducked again, pressing himself against his horse's neck. An arrow missed him by inches, and he flinched, terrified. Rage rippled through him, even as he straightened up and rode tall, leaning forwards in the saddle slightly to urge his horse to go faster and raised his sword as he and his men drew closer to the fighting men. Then, suddenly, it vanished, and he realized it was not his rage he could feel. Abruptly, he realized he was ahead of the other soldiers. He could hear their furious roars around him, and he could hear the heavy panting of the horses and the chink of armor, but there was no one riding level with him. Those that had been, were gone. He shook his head slightly. This was no Dothraki army he was fighting with, where they fought alone, bled alone and died alone. These were Knights of the Vale who worked together, who fought together, who bled together and who died together. He knew that. Yet he still found himself ahead of the men behind him. He grimaced and tightened his grip around his sword and the horse's reins. "For House Targaryen!" he roared as his horse closed the remaining distance to the men. "For Prince Viserys!" "For the king!" The closest ranks of men, Lannister soldiers clad in red and gold, had begun to turn and were forming up and raising shields. Something brushed against him, and he turned slightly for half a second to look at Aryan. His dragon did not meet his gaze but instead unleashed another furious roar. He was less than 2 meters away when he gave the command. "Dracarys!" The men vanished under the torrent of fire. His horse made to balk but he kicked it forward sharply, and it jumped over the burning, screaming men. His fingers flexed around the pommel of his sword, and he swung it cleanly through the first man who he encountered. Around him, the flames burned, and bile forced its way up his throat as he smelled charring flesh and heard the screams of the men that Aryan had set aflame. He pushed his horse through the gap that had been created as men had backed away from Aryan, who had banked sharply upwards and was circling above. A gust of wind washed over him, and he heaved in a deep breath of clean air. He swung his sword again, parrying the blade of a Lannister soldier, and then brought it back down, cutting through flesh and bone as he did so. He turned away, unable to watch the man fall. His eyes flicked over the field as he moved mechanically, parrying blows and dealing back blows of his own. Above him, Aryan roared angrily every time someone dared to lift their blade against him. A horse bolted past him, a dead rider still seated on its back, slumped against the poor animal's neck with arrows sticking out of him. He turned away. Prince Viserys. He turned, lifting his sword up just in time to meet the blade of a Lannister soldier seated on horseback. The soldier's eyes widened slightly through the gaps in his helm, surprised that Viserys had parried his blow. He did not stop or think, instead he simply pushed the man's sword away using his own sword and, as the man floundered, brought his sword down in a wide arch to cut through the gap between the man's helm and armor. Above him, Aryan let out a screech of victory. Around him, Knights of the Vale surged past, and he chanced a glance toward where the Lannister soldiers had been starting to encircle the Northmen and Riverlands men and saw, to his delight, that they were beginning to turn, not all of them, but enough. "Knights of the Vale with me!" he roared. Roars echoed back at him. He kicked his horse forward, moving his feet out of the stirrups, knowing from his time with the Dothraki, and the stories that Jorah Mormont had translated for him, that fighting with your feet trapped was foolish. More and more Knights of the Vale fell in around him, rallying to his call, and together they sought to cut a path through the thousands of Lannister soldiers that, whilst far too disciplined to scatter, were no longer in uniform lines as they advanced on the army. He rode with them this time, cutting through soldiers on both horseback and on the ground. He swung his sword again and again. The blood pounded in his ears and the roars of the men behind him drowned out every other noise. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and he longed to take off his helm, but he did not. More and more the scent of blood, death, sweat and piss leached into the air around him and sunk into his helm until the air was so hot, smelly and oppressive, and he felt more bile rise up inside him. It was worse every time his sword cut through a man. He could taste sick in his mouth and had to swallow it. He longed to turn away, kick his horse hard enough that she sprinted away from the battlefield and to never come back. But he did not. Instead, he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Underneath him, his horse whinnied and let out shrieks as slowly it began to tire. His arm ached and sweat poured down his face, but he kept fighting until, eventually, his horse began to collapse underneath him, the ride of the last few days proving too much. He tumbled forward, grasping its mane to not fly over the side of it, and made to remove himself from its back. Before he could, a sword swung across his vision. He lifted his own in retaliation but was spared from deflecting the blow as the man was grabbed from behind, his head snapped back, and a blade drawn cleanly across his throat. The man behind his would-be attacker took half a step back and the body between them fell to the floor. He nodded to the stranger, a Stark, clearly, judging by the direwolf carved into the chest of his armor, and turned around to throw himself back into the fray. He thought he could hear the Stark say something, but he ignored him. His sword rose and fell. At some point he picked up a shield and used it to smash men aside before he swiped his sword and cut through them. Oren rushed past, his helm gone and a snarl on his lips, and Viserys made to follow. Better to fight with an ally than alone, one of the lessons he had learned from Oren. Together they beat a path closer to the middle of the battlefield, where Northmen stood fighting back to back against Lannister soldiers. Above him, Aryan shrieked and then a blast of flames rushed over Viserys and the half-dozen Lannister soldiers that stood between Oren, Viserys and the northern troops caught alight. In their panic to try and put out the flames, the Lannister soldiers flailed uselessly and Viserys and Oren launched forward and cut through them in moments. Once he had disposed of the last man, he sucked in a deep breath and felt the bile rise in his throat again as he could almost taste charred flesh on his tongue as it worked its way down his throat. He shook his head as above him Aryan and the larger dragon let out roars as they swooped over the battlefield. In front of him, Oren kept pushing forward and Viserys made to follow. Then he stopped as he caught sight of Jon Snow's dragon swooping lower and angling down as though to land. What was he doing? He watched as the dragon landed far from the fighting and Jon Snow dismounted and then crossed quickly as he drew his sword, without even looking at the dragon, toward the armies. Men at the edge of the fighting fell in beside him as he ran, sword raised, into the fray. For the king! Someone roared and across the battlefield men answered the cry. They love him. Nearby the Northmen, that Viserys and Oren had cut a path to, fought with even greater strength and began to push back the Lannister forces. He watched as a small man, no, a woman, swung a morning star down once on a Lannister soldier, crumpling his breastplate into his chest and then swung it down one more time on the man's helm, even as the man lay on his back, gasping for air, and caved it in. She did not even spare the dead man a passing look before she spun away, taking down another soldier. He followed her, Oren on his tail, and together they dispatched dozens of men. He turned, coughing slightly as smoke worked its way into his throat again, and watched as a Lannister soldier snuck up behind the small woman who was stood over another soldier, foot on the man's breastplate as she tried to dislodge her morning star. He snarled, leaping forward but knew he would not get there in time. Above him, Aerion roared suddenly. Dracarys! The man behind the woman went up in a torrent of dragon fire. She screamed, launching herself away from the blistering heat behind her, and turned toward the man. Then she turned her head up to sky to look at Aerion as he flew off and then glanced around her. He nodded when their eyes met and received a nod of his own back. With Prince Viserys! She roared, her voice rough and deep like a man's. With Prince Viserys! Oren yelled, his own voice cutting through the air. Around him, men and women fell in, their eyes locked on Lannister soldiers nearby but unmoving, waiting for his command. For the king! He screamed, knowing that it was he must do. Nearby, Aerion let out another roar and then it was drowned out as the larger dragon let out its own. Sunlight vanished for a moment as Jon Snow's dragon flew overhead. He spared neither dragon a look and instead raised his sword and launched himself back into the fighting. The Lannister soldiers had huddled together now and still outnumbered the combined forces mustered under Jon Snow. He knew they would need to move quickly to stop the Lannister army fully regrouping, and thereby allowing the archers being able to loose their arrows again, and smiled as around him soldiers took up position. A soldier rushed toward him, but he caught the sword against his own and pushed against the man, using the man's surprise to his advantage. The man tried to dart backwards but Viserys kept pushing. The man managed to get traction but it was too late. Viserys gave one last shove and sent the man toppling backwards into the dirt and then the woman with the morning star was there, smashing it against the man's helm. He hunched over, panting heavily but then straightened again and watched as a man in orange and gold rushed past, a spear in his hand and no helm on, closely followed by a brown-haired man with the golden rose of Highgarden emblazoned on his chest. His chest tightened and he sucked in a sharp breath. A sword swung into view but he turned, ducking as he did so, and then rose. The man who had slashed his sword at him had no helm and, not giving the man a moment to recover, he lunged forward, propelling himself off the ground and shoved his sword straight up and into the other man's face. They fell together, toppling backwards into the dirt. As soon as he caught his breath again, he pulled back his sword and turned back to the battle. Up ahead, more Lannister soldiers mustered together. "Don't let them form up!" someone roared. He turned, wondering who had given the order. And his eyes met Grey. Stood only a few feet away, with blood and ash covering his entire body, Jon Snow stood with his sword raised. His eyes moved over the other man as around them the battle raged. He tried, desperately, to find anything of House Targaryen in Jon Snow. His eyes moved across the man's face, his shoulders, his body, even his legs. He saw nothing. Then, as Jon Snow met his eyes again and they widened as recognition flashed inside them and a smile split the other man's face in two, he saw it. Mother's eyes. The same crinkle, just with less lines, and the same shape. The same softness. He turned away, unable to look at Jon Snow any longer. Around him the battle raged, and he threw himself forwards, launching viciously towards a man in Marbrand colors. The man was better than him, his form was sharper, his cuts cleaner, and yet Viserys had him beat in only a few slashes of his sword. He spun away, and his eyes fixed on the sword in Jon Snow's hand as the man ran past Viserys, followed by an older man with a direwolf emblem etched into his armor, and he felt anger rise up in him. He turned, spinning, and sliced his sword across the breastplate of a man who had lunged at him. It had no effect, his sword simply glancing off the man's armor. He pushed the man back, snarling furiously as anger engulfed him, and with one final push sliced his sword clean through the gap between the man's helm and armor. Then he turned away again, eyes fixed on the sword in his nephew's hand. It should have been mine. He pressed on, following the path Jon Snow had cut through the battlefield, moving closer to the now fully regrouped Lannister soldiers. Around him, men kept fighting, but he pushed any who came for him aside, a snarl on his lips and his eyes barely looking at them as he focused on the sword. He was so close. Within striking distance. On the battlefield no one would notice it was him who swung the sword, he was sure. He could do it. Then, suddenly, he caught sight of a glimmer of gold and green out of the corner of his eye and turned to watch as Aerion flew over the battle alongside the larger dragon his nephew had claimed as his. Anger, no, fury, rippled through him, and for a moment he was lost in it. His sword slipped slightly, his grip grew lax, and the anger washed through him. His eyes followed the path of Aerion, and he watched as some of the Lannister forces in the distance raised their bows and leveled them high into the sky, clearly aiming for the dragons. No! He roared, his panicked scream lost in the sound of battle. He took half a step forward, knowing what was to come. Aerion was too small and his scales not strong enough to withstand arrows, and unable to stop it. Then, as the arrows loosed and flew toward his dragon, he watched as the larger dragon swooped over the top of Aerion, forcing his dragon under its scales, and let out a blast of fire as the arrows fell on her instead. The ones that were not incinerated by the fire bounced off the white and grey dragon's scales and fell onto the battlefield. The two roared in unison, the larger dragon nearly drowning out Aerion, and turned towards the archers. Together they flew straight toward the archers, right over Viserys, and he met Aerion's eyes and felt anger pulse through the bond. Anger that was directed at him. Abruptly, Aerion turned his eyes away from Viserys and opened his mouth in another roar. In unison, the two dragons let loose their flames and the archers vanished under a torrent of dragon fire. He felt his arm sag slightly. In front of him, Jon Snow turned around, as though he too had felt the anger and knew exactly what Viserys had been thinking. Their eyes met, his breath caught for a moment, and then the other man titled his head slightly before he spun away, his sword raised. Out of the corner of his eye he watched a sword rise, but then it fell, and where the dead man had been, Oren loomed large, blood coating his face and a wild gleam in his eyes, and shoved Viserys in the direction Jon Snow had gone. "Stick together!" Oren roared. "Together, Viserys!" There was a gap on Jon Snow's right now, right at the front of the forces that fought for him and facing the remaining Lannister troops. Whoever had been there before had clearly fallen in the time Viserys had been looking at Aerion, and Viserys took it, slotting into the formation next to his nephew without a second thought. Chapter 27, Vengeance. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary, The Battle at Riverrun from the Eyes of Jon and Robb. 299 AC, Ned Stark. "My grandmother wished me to ask you something," Garland Tyrell said, several hours after his arrival in the encampment when Ned had gone to take food to him. "She wishes to know if you knew that your sister and Prince Rhaegar had wed." He froze. The bowl of broth and bread he had been holding shook in his hand, and some of the hot broth slopped onto his hand, scalding him. He did not react to the burn, and instead he tightened his fingers around the bowl to stop it slipping free, and stared at the man stood in front of him. Then he relaxed. Garland Tyrell was asking him alone, which meant he had no desire to tell Jon without Ned being present. He heaved out a sigh as he realized that House Tyrell had not blindly assumed that he had known and kept it hidden. "I did not," he admitted quietly. "But I had hoped." "She gave him a Targaryen name." "Daeron." "Named for the young dragon," Garland replied. "A good name. Grandmother will be pleased." He grimaced, remembering Jon's face when he had told his nephew of his name. His name and the fact they wed, "It is the best proof we shall ever have of the manner of his birth." It was not rape then. "A marriage does not mean rape did not happen," he murmured. "Where is this proof of the marriage?" "Grandmother knows." "But you do not." Garland barked out a laugh. "Grandmother tells me what I need to know and lets me puzzle out the rest." He put the bowl of broth and bread down on the small table in the tent that Garland had been given. When the man gestured for Ned to take a seat on the bed whilst Garland took the chair to eat his meal, he did so without protest. "Grandmother is difficult," Garland said eventually when he had swallowed his first mouthful of broth. "Yet, she agreed that my sister should wed your son when she could not be sure it was the wisest match. What does that tell you?" There was another pause whilst Garland took another mouthful of broth and then dunked his bread in the bowl before he ripped some off with his teeth and swallowed it. "That she trusts your brother's judgment." Garland barked out another laugh, his eyes lifting from his bowl for a moment before he turned back to his food. "Oh, she trusts Willers, as much as she might trust anyone, I suppose," he said after a lengthy pause. Another mouthful of broth vanished before he spoke again. "As much as she tries to hide it, she does love Margaery and she would do anything to make sure she was happy and safe. The second my sister decided she would wed your son, my grandmother accepted she would not secure Tyrell blood on the throne before this war is won." He watched Garland eat in silence for a moment, trying to understand what the man was trying to tell him. Around them, the noise and bustle of the camp continued,